Eira Sallow learned early that hope had a filing system. In the registry hall of the Bureau of Civic Enchantments, everything did. The ceiling arched like the inside of a seashell pail, ridged plaster that gathered lamplight and made it look clean. Rows of tall windows faced the canal and let in a grey-blue shimmer. The sound of water was always there, muted by thick panes and thicker rules, as constant as the scratch of nibs and the thunk of stamps. Hope came in on paper. It arrived folded into petitions and tied with twine, sealed with wax, delivered by couriers in rain-dark coats. It arrived smudged from nervous fingers, too tightly rolled, or lovingly pressed flat between boards so it would look respectable. It arrived with tidy signatures and with none at all, because some people were afraid to put their name to longing. Eira sat at desk 9, section D, beneath a brass placard that read Registry, Minor Enchantments. The placard had once been polished every morning. Now it carried a dullness that no one admitted noticing. She wore sleeves that buttoned at the wrists to keep her cuffs from dipping into ink. Her hair was pinned back with an old quill clip that had lost its feather long ago. She had a face that disappeared into a room, soft features, quiet eyes, until you watched long enough to realize she was always watching. On her blotter lay the day's stack: requests for warmth charms in unheated tenements, a ward against cellar mold, a small luck tilt for a fisherman's nets, a permit to mend a cracked fountain with binding sigils rather than masonry. Most were harmless. Most would be denied. The Bureau did not call it denial, of course. It called it adherence. At the long counter beyond the desks, citizens stood in a line that never seemed to shorten, each holding their own careful paper like a small offering. The clerks at the counter spoke in the same low, clipped cadence, as if too much warmth might count as an unlicensed charm. Name. District. Nature of request. Purpose. Have you attempted self-resolution before petitioning? A man with chapped hands answered too quickly and stumbled over his words. A woman with a shawl pulled tight over her hair tried to smile as if she had practiced it. A boy no older than 12 held a rolled petition taller than his forearm and looked up at the counter as if it might suddenly become kind. Eira listened without meaning to. She listened because the words were the only part of the room that still sounded alive. When a petition made it to her desk, it was already numbered and tagged. Someone else's handwriting had placed it into a category. Someone else had decided which shelf of possibility it belonged to. Eira unrolled the fisherman's petition first. The paper smelled faintly of salt and onions, like a kitchen that had worked too hard. His request was modest, an approved luck tilt, only a finger's breadth of fortune, enough to keep his net from snagging on the canal pilings. He had written, in a line too small for his large hand, "I don't want more. I just want not less." Eira stared at that sentence until the ink began to blur. She reached for the stamp. Denied, insufficient justification, the red letters declared, as if hope itself could be prosecuted for lack of evidence. Her hand hovered. Across the aisle, Lysant Wren caught her eye and lifted one brow in silent question. Lysant sat at desk 11 with her hair cut blunt at the jaw and ink smudges always staining the side of her thumb, like she'd tried to scrub her hands clean of her work and failed. She had learned to make her face blank when petitioners cried, but she had never learned to make her eyes forget. Eira's fingers tightened on the stamp handle until her knuckles went pale. Then, with a small exhale, she pressed it down. Thump. The fisherman's hope was now a document of refusal. Eira slid the paper into the outgoing tray and kept her expression carefully still. The other clerks were doing the same. Stamps rose and fell in a steady rhythm that made the day feel like a machine that ran on disappointment. By noon, her wrist ached. On the far wall, a mural showed Vellune as it had been before the bright spill, boats gliding under ribbons of light, children leaning over bridges, laughing as if laughter had no consequences. Eira had heard the older clerks speak of those days in the same tone they used for fire. Careless. Dangerous. Gone. At the center of the mural, the canals gleamed with swirls of painted gold. In real life, the canal outside the registry hall window looked like dull metal, as if someone had drained the color out of it and sold it to pay for more locks and wards. Eira took her allotted break at the precise moment the clock chimed 2 bells, clean and hollow. She did not eat much. The ledger entries she'd stamped into place sat behind her eyes like a second list of names. She stood by the window, holding her tin cup of water, and watched the canal. A barge passed, slow, its load covered in tarred cloth. A rower in a hood kept his gaze on the water. Behind the barge, a little wave of foam curled and died against the stone wall. Something moved in the surface, just a flicker. For a moment Eira thought it was a fish, or a bit of leaf caught in the eddy. Then the flicker shaped itself into a pale line, like a thread of smoke trapped underwater, and slid away. Her mouth went dry. It had been happening more often lately, those faint drifting smears in the canal. A shimmer. A hush in the air. People called it fatigue, called it the season, called it the price of safety. But Eira had started noticing other things too, the way a woman at the counter forgot the name of her own sister, stammering and laughing as if it were a harmless mistake, the way a street musician outside the bureau doors stopped mid-chorus, fingers frozen, and stared at his lute like it had betrayed him. The city was losing pieces of itself, quietly, politely, as if even its unraveling had to be approved. Eira set down her cup and returned to her desk. Her afternoon was a blur of ink and paper. When the last petition was processed and the lamps were lit along the hall, the line at the counter thinned at last. Clerks rose, stretched stiff backs, spoke in murmurs about supper and transit schedules. The registry hall emptied with the slow relief of a room exhaling. Eira stayed. She always stayed until the last clerk had left. She waited until the hall was not merely empty but officially so, the caretaker passing through, the lock clicking on the main doors, the faint shimmer of the ward line sealing the threshold like a thin film over water. Only then did she gather the day's discarded scraps. They were not supposed to be taken. Petition paper was considered legally sensitive, even when torn. But Eira's hands moved with practiced care, selecting the pieces that were clean enough to fold, the scraps that still held the faint ether silt sheen, the barely visible sparkle that meant the paper could hold intent. She did not take anything with names intact. She did not keep the numbered tags. She only gathered blank backs and rejected margins, the places where someone's hope had not had room to fit. She tucked the scraps into the inner pocket of her coat and left through the side door that opened onto the canal walkway. Outside, Vellune's evening was a wash of mist and lamp glow. Lanterns hung from iron hooks along the stone walls, their light reflected in fractured lines in the water. The air smelled of damp brick and distant cooking, of riverweed and ink. Eira walked with her head slightly bowed, as if she belonged to the shadows. People passed her without looking. That was a kind of mercy. She crossed 2 bridges and turned down an alley that ran alongside a narrower canal, where the stone walls rose high and the water moved quietly. Here, the city felt older. The lanterns were farther apart, and the silence between them seemed to press against the skin. At a bend in the canal, where a small spillway carried water into a lower channel, Eira stopped. She checked the street behind her. Empty. She took out one scrap of paper and smoothed it against her palm. It was the corner of a petition, a torn arc of an official seal still visible at the edge. From her pocket she drew a small bone folder, worn smooth, and a stub of graphite for drafting. She did not use ink for this, ink lingered. Graphite was honest in its simplicity. Eira folded. She had practiced until her fingers knew the shape without thought, crease, turn, tuck, press, each motion crisp and quiet. The paper became a little vessel, its pointed prow sharp as a promise. She smoothed the edges with her thumbnail until the creases held. Then she wrote inside the hull, where only the water would read it. Her wishes were never grand. She had learned that grandness called attention, and attention brought inspectors. Tonight she wrote, "Let the baker on Nettle Street remember why she sings." A small warmth stirred in her chest as she wrote the words, as if the act of naming kindness gave it weight. She touched the inside of the boat with 2 fingers and breathed out, not a spell spoken aloud but an intention laid down like a thread. The boat's paper shimmered faintly. Ether silt caught her breath and held it for a heartbeat. Eira added the last mark, a dissolving sigil, a simple loop and dot, placed near the stern. It ensured the vessel would not last beyond dawn. It was a safety valve, a promise to the city that nothing she made would linger where it could become dangerous. She knelt by the water. The canal's surface was dark, reflecting the lantern light as broken coins. The air above it felt colder than the street, as if the water carried its own hush. Eira set the boat down gently. For a moment it sat motionless, so fragile it seemed a breath could crush it. Then the current caught the pointed prow and nudged it forward. It drifted. It drifted as if it knew where it was going. Eira watched it pass under the nearest lantern. The paper brightened for a second, then slid back into shadow. Something in the water shifted, a pale thread beneath the surface, like the flicker she'd seen at the registry hall window. It moved toward the boat, and Eira's throat tightened. But instead of wrapping around the boat, the thread seemed to soften. The water's surface smoothed, the ripples easing, as if the canal itself took a calmer breath. Eira exhaled slowly. She folded another boat. This one carried, "Let Bram Quill's locks hold true through the night." The next, "Let the musician find his lost chorus." Each wish was small enough to be humble, specific enough to be kind, but never so sharp it could cut into someone else's will. Eira had rules for herself. She kept them as carefully as the Bureau kept its laws, perhaps more carefully, because hers were built to keep others safe rather than controlled. When she had sent 5 boats down the canal, she paused. Her hands were cold. The damp had seeped through her coat. She could see her breath in the lantern light. That was when she heard footsteps. Not the careless scuff of someone going home, nor the quick light patter of a child. These were measured steps, deliberate, as if each footfall had been placed with the same precision as a stamp on paper. Eira's blood went thin. She turned her head slightly, not fully, just enough to look over her shoulder. A figure stood at the mouth of the alley, framed by mist and lantern glow. He wore a long dark coat with the Bureau's insignia stitched in thread so subtle it looked like shadow until the light caught it. A narrow leather satchel hung at his hip. In one hand he held a folded document case, its clasp gleaming. His hair was dark and neatly cut, his face hard-lined in the way of someone who did not allow himself to soften. His eyes were a cold grey that reflected lantern light without warming to it. Inspector. Eira knew the Bureau's inspectors by reputation alone. They were spoken of like storms, unavoidable, impersonal, ruinous. This one did not shout. He did not rush at her. He simply stood there and looked at the canal, at the faint glimmer of paper drifting away. Then his gaze returned to her. "Miss Sallow," he said. Her name, spoken in that calm voice, felt like a hand closing around her throat. She rose slowly from her kneel, keeping her palms open to show she held nothing dangerous, only a scrap of paper and a bone folder, harmless tools in the wrong context. "How do you know?" Her voice broke. She swallowed and tried again. "How do you know my name?" He stepped into the alley, the mist curling around his boots. "You sign your ledger entries. You also have a habit of remaining after official close." His eyes flicked to her coat pocket, the slight bulge of paper within. "And you have been seen near the canals on nights when unusual incidents occur." Eira's pulse hammered in her ears. "I'm only folding." He glanced at the water again. Another boat slid past, catching a seam of lantern light like a white moth. "Sending." Eira's fingers tightened on the scrap of paper she hadn't yet folded. Her mind raced through the Bureau codes, the penalties, the sentences. Illegal wishcraft was not treated like a petty infraction. It was treated like a relapse. "Inspector," she managed, her voice quiet but steadying as fear forced her into precision, "those are not, they dissolve." He did not move closer. He took a small brass disc from his satchel instead, etched with warding lines. He held it between 2 fingers and let it hang in the air, as if listening to it. A normal wish violation would make the disc flare bright, condemning, undeniable. Eira had seen such discs in training manuals, drawn like warning suns. The disc did not flare. It dimly pulsed once, like the slow beat of a sleeping heart, and then settled into stillness. Something unreadable crossed the inspector's face. For the first time, his stern composure shifted not into anger, but into a flicker of confusion. Eira's breath caught. "It didn't, it should," he said, very softly, as if the words were for himself. He looked at the disc again, then at the canal. His jaw tightened, the muscle along it working as if he were biting back a thought. "What is your name?" Eira asked before she could stop herself. His eyes snapped to her, sharp. The question was not allowed. Bureau staff did not address inspectors familiarly. Names were a kind of intimacy, and intimacy was unregulated. His gaze held hers for a long moment, heavy with unspoken warning. Then, with a controlled exhale, he said, Corven Rooke. The name sounded like a lock turning. Eira's heart lurched at the fact that he had given it at all. Corven's attention returned to the canal. Another pale thread moved beneath the surface, drifting toward a boat, and again it softened, as if soothed. He watched that, and something in his expression tightened with a different kind of strain, less the strain of suspicion, more the strain of recognition. Illegal wishes, he said, as if reciting a line he had spoken too many times, are a threat to civic stability. Eira lifted her chin a fraction. Her hands trembled, but she kept them visible. These aren't a threat. They're small. Small things started the bright spill, Corven said. Eira flinched. Everyone in Vellune grew up under that shadow. The bright spill was the reason the Bureau existed in its current form, a night when the city's collective wishing had surged, spilling enchantment into streets and bodies and waterways until reality bent under the weight of desire. The aftermath had been famine in some districts, fever dream joy in others, and then collapse and exhaustion of magic that left scars in stone and memory. But Eira also remembered what the mural showed. The golden canals. The laughter. She swallowed hard. I don't wish for more than dawn. Corven's gaze sharpened at that. Explain. Eira hesitated. A rational part of her screamed that anything she said could be used against her. But the alley was narrow, the canal close, and the boats were already gone. Lies would be clumsy. Silence would be guilt. So she did what she always did when she was frightened, she told the truth carefully. I take petition scraps, she said, forcing herself to meet his eyes. Paper that's already primed. I fold it into vessels. I write a wish inside, something humble. I bind it with a dissolving sigil. It carries the intent down the canal, and then it breaks at dawn. There's no lingering enchantment. No accumulation. Corven's mouth tightened. You understand that is unlawful. Yes, she whispered. And you continue. Eira's throat worked. She could have said because it helps. Because the city is fading. Because people are forgetting how to be alive. But those were feelings, and feelings were easily dismissed as hysteria. Instead she said, because I can't keep stamping denial and pretending it isn't feeding something. Corven's eyes narrowed slightly. Feeding what? Eira's gaze flicked to the canal. The pale thread beneath the surface shivered, then smoothed again, following the wake of a boat. The hush, she said. Whatever it is that's been taking things. I've seen it. It follows the boats, and it quiets. Corven's hand tightened on his document case. He looked like a man who wanted to reject what he'd heard and could not, because his own eyes had seen the same movement. He stepped closer at last, not crowding her, but near enough that Eira could see faint lines of fatigue at the corners of his eyes. He smelled faintly of rain and metal, like a key carried too long in a pocket. I have been assigned to investigate illegal wish incidents, he said. Your boats match the reports. Eira's stomach dropped. Then you'll arrest me. Corven didn't answer immediately. His gaze went to the water again. A boat slid past the spillway and into the lower channel, turning slowly, its little prow pointing toward the city's deeper canals. The pale thread beneath the surface drifted after it, no longer hungry, more like curious. Corven's voice, when it came, was quieter than before. I am required, he said carefully, to enforce the statutes as written. Eira hugged her arms tighter around herself. The damp cold was nothing compared to the chill of those words. She stared at the stone beneath her boots so she wouldn't have to watch him decide how to ruin her life. A sound carried from farther down the canal, a laugh, faint and startled, as if someone had surprised themselves by making it. It was the kind of laugh that ended too quickly, like a flame that didn't trust itself to burn. Eira's head lifted. Corven heard it too. His posture stiffened, as if the sound had struck some hidden nerve. He looked at her again. His expression was controlled, but something behind it was strained, like a rope pulled too tight. Give me one, he said. Eira blinked. What? One of your boats, he repeated, holding out his hand. Unlaunched. Her heart stumbled. Why? Because, he said, and there was a flicker of something raw in his eyes, gone in an instant. My warding disc did not flare. I need to understand why. Eira's fingers fumbled in her pocket. She drew out a folded boat she had prepared earlier, its hull creased clean, the dissolving mark already inked in graphite. She hesitated, then placed it carefully in his palm. Corven held it as if it might bite him. His fingers were long, his nails trimmed, his hand steady in a way hers never was when she was afraid. He turned the little boat over once, inspecting the folds, the faint shimmer in the paper. His thumb brushed the inside edge of the hull where the wish lay written. His jaw tightened. For a moment, Eira thought he would crumple it, destroy it, end the conversation with the finality of law. Instead, Corven's gaze lifted to hers. You've written this with restraint, he said, as if the admission cost him. No coercion. No demand. Eira didn't trust herself to speak, so she only nodded. Corven looked past her, toward the alley mouth, as if checking for witnesses. The street remained empty, the fog thick, the lantern light wavering. When he spoke again, his words came out like a decision forced through tight teeth. You will come with me. Eira's stomach clenched. Her hands went numb. To the bureau? Not to the holding cells, Corven said quickly, then paused as if he hadn't meant to reveal that distinction. He corrected himself into formality. To a place where we can speak without being overheard. Eira stared at him. Why? Because you might be right, he did not say. Because I saw the hush soften, he did not say. Because something in me is tied to these laws, and I can feel it tightening, he did not say. He only said, because if you are doing what you claim, then your illegal wishes may not be the crime I was sent to stop. Eira's breath came shallow. She glanced at the canal, where the last of her boats slipped out of sight. Corven still held the paper boat in his palm. His fingers curved around it, but he did not crush it. He was protecting, almost without realizing. It was the smallest gesture, hardly a gesture at all. Yet it landed in Eira's chest like a spark. She nodded once, the motion barely visible. Corven stepped back, giving her space to move first, as if he understood that fear could feel like a cage even when no bars were present. Eira drew her coat tighter and followed him out of the alley into the mist-laced street, her heart thudding with dread and with something else, thin, bright, and dangerous as a match struck in the dark. Behind them, in the canal, the pale thread beneath the water drifted after the dissolving boats, and for the first time in days, the water's surface seemed to ripple as if it remembered how to breathe. Eira had expected irons. She had expected the hard, public humiliation of being walked through the bureau's stone corridors with her wrists bound, clerks pretending not to stare while staring anyway, her name quietly becoming a cautionary tale. Instead, Corven Rooke guided her along the canal walk as if she were simply another pedestrian caught in the fog. He did not grip her arm. He did not touch her at all. Yet his presence beside her felt like a lock set into place, firm, unyielding, and, unnervingly, careful. They moved through lamplight and mist, past shuttered stalls and quiet doorways. The city's night sounds were restrained, a distant cartwheel, a muffled cough, a dog's single-board bark. Even the canal seemed subdued, its water sliding beneath bridges with a hush that made Eira think of mouths held shut. Corven led her to a small door set into the side of a limestone building that leaned toward the water. A narrow sign above it read Archive Annex, authorized entry only. He produced a key from inside his coat and opened it without ceremony. Inside, the air smelled of dust, dried reeds, and old ink. The room was long and low-ceilinged, lined with shelves that held boxes and ledger-wrapped bundles. A single lamp burned on a table, its light pooled over scattered papers like a private confession. Eira stopped just inside the threshold, uncertain. Corven closed the door behind them, and the click of the lock sounded loud in the quiet. He set his satchel on the table and, with the same measured precision she had seen in his steps, withdrew a brass warding disc and placed it beside the lamp. He did not look at her for a moment. He looked at the disc as if it were a judge he had to persuade. Sit, he said, then softened it by adding, if you want. Eira remained standing, hands clasped in front of her, the way she stood at the counter when a senior clerk asked a question she was afraid to answer incorrectly. Corven opened his document case. It held forms. Of course, it did. But it also held something she had not expected, a thin book of ward scripts, margins filled with cramped notes, and a little leather pouch that clinked faintly when he moved it. He noticed her gaze. "Calibrators," he said, briefly. "For reading residue." "Residue," Eira repeated, her voice careful. Corven's eyes flicked to her, then away. "The kind left by wishcraft," he said, as if speaking the word too warmly might become an infraction. Eira swallowed. "You said your disc should have flared." "Yes. And it didn't." Corven's mouth tightened. "It shouldn't be possible." Eira's fingers worried at each other. "Unless the boats aren't doing what you think illegal wishes do." His gaze sharpened, and for a heartbeat the stern inspector returned, ready to strike down speculation. Then Corven exhaled through his nose, slow, controlled. "Show me." Eira blinked. "Here." He nodded toward the lamplit table. "Fold one. Write one. Bind it. In front of me." Her pulse jumped. The act had always been private. In shadow. Under lanterns and fog, where the canal could take her secrets and carry them away. Doing it here, under a bureau lamp, with an inspector watching, she felt exposed down to her bones. But she had already been caught. Her secrecy was already broken. If there was any chance of keeping her boats from becoming a charge, she had to make him see. Eira reached into her pocket and pulled out 2 scraps of petition paper, smoothing them on the table with the heel of her palm. The paper still held the faint shimmer of ether silt, like a dusting of ground pearl. Corven watched her hands closely, his expression unreadable. Eira chose the cleaner scrap and began to fold. Crease, turn, tuck, press. Her fingers trembled at first, but the familiar geometry steadied her. The boat took shape with crisp edges, its hull cupped like a tiny cradle. Corven leaned closer without realizing it, his focus narrowing. His shadow fell across the table, darkening the paper's sheen. Eira paused before writing. The wishes always began in her chest, a small ache she translated into words. She was careful not to write anything too large. Nothing that would lash. Nothing that would grab at the world like a fist. Tonight, in this room, her wish turned unexpectedly toward the man watching her. She pushed that thought away at once, heat rising to her face. She could not. She would not. Wishes like that were wrong in every way that mattered. So she wrote something else, something safe and simple, meant for no one in particular. "Let the city remember a small joy by morning." Corven's gaze dropped to the words. His jaw flexed slightly, as if he felt the meaning like pressure against an old bruise. Eira drew the dissolving sigil, loop and dot near the stern. Then, because she had learned that magic listened best to honesty, she placed 2 fingers against the hull and let her breath out slowly, directing her intent into the paper. Not force. Not demand. Just an offering. The boat shivered. The shimmer of the ether silt brightened for half a heartbeat. Corven's warding disc did not flare. It pulsed once, faint, almost reluctant, then settled, quiet as a cat that had decided not to scratch. Corven's hand snapped out, hovering over the boat but stopping short of touching it. He stared at the disc, then at the boat, then at Eira. "Again," he said. Eira frowned. "It will be the same." "Again," Corven repeated, his voice sharper now, not with anger but with urgency he clearly did not like showing. Eira folded another boat with the second scrap. This time she wrote, "Let the canal waters run clear tonight." She bound it. Breathed intent. The boat shimmered. The disc pulsed. No flare. Corven's mouth parted slightly, as if he had planned for every outcome except this one. He reached into his leather pouch and drew out a pinch of tiny glass beads, each etched with a different symbol. He set 3 on the table in a small triangle around the boat. The beads caught the lamplight and turned it into thin lines. "Stay still," he said, then seemed to realize the absurdity of ordering her body to remain motionless in a room full of paper. He amended it, "Don't touch the vessel." Eira folded her hands and watched. Corven murmured a ward-reading phrase under his breath, not a dramatic incantation, but a measured string of syllables that sounded like numbers spoken in a foreign language. The beads brightened faintly, then dimmed, then brightened again. Corven's gaze moved between them like a man tracking a pulse. There's no lash, he said finally, and the words came out as if he didn't trust them. No coercive residue. The intent loop is humble. Humble, Eira echoed, unsure whether that was praise or condemnation. Corven looked at her sharply. Did you study wishcraft? No, she said quickly. Not like that. Only petition scripting. Basic seals. I'm not, she swallowed. I'm not gifted. Corven's expression didn't shift, but his eyes narrowed a fraction. You are careful, he said. That is a different thing. Eira's cheeks warmed again, a flush that had nothing to do with the lamp. She stared down at her hands. Careful is all I have. For a moment, the room was quiet except for the faint rustle of old paper on the shelves, as if the archives themselves were listening. Corven's voice dropped. Tell me about the hush. Eira's throat tightened. It's hard to explain. It's like the city is being pressed. Like someone is holding a hand over its mouth. People forget little things. They stop laughing mid-breath. Colors look wrong. She hesitated, then admitted, I've seen something in the canals. Pale, like a thread under water. Corven's gaze turned inward, his face tightening as if he were bracing against a pain he did not want to acknowledge. You've seen it too, Eira said softly. Corven's eyes flicked to hers, then away. I have investigated reports, he said. A pattern of emotional fatigue. Memory slips. Increased petition volume for mood stabilizers and sleep wards. The Bureau attributes it to ordinary strain. And you believe that? Eira asked before she could stop herself. Corven's jaw set. I believe what the statutes require me to believe, he said, and there was something in his voice that made Eira's stomach twist. Do you always speak like that? She asked, quieter. Like someone wrote you on a page. Corven went very still. The lamplight made his face look carved. For a moment, Eira thought she had gone too far, that he would snap back into his role and end this strange, fragile conversation with a charge sheet. Instead, Corven reached into his inner coat pocket and withdrew something thin and folded. He opened it slowly on the table. It was not a form. It was a strip of parchment, old and worn at the creases. A binding clause, written in dense, elegant script that looked like it belonged in a law book and a spell book at the same time. At the bottom was Corven's signature. Eira's breath caught. What is that? She whispered. Corven did not look at her. He looked at the parchment as if looking at it too long might cost him something. My appointment oath, he said. And my bind. Eira leaned in despite herself. The script was difficult, but she could recognize legal structure, the if-then clauses, the obligations, the penalties. It was law written as enchantment. Her eyes caught on one line, and her stomach dropped. Should the undersigned knowingly permit an unlawful wish to stand, the undersigned shall forfeit a memory of personal significance. Eira's hand rose to her mouth. Corven's voice was flat, as if he were reciting a regulation. The Bureau calls it an assurance of integrity. It's a curse, Eira breathed. Corven's fingers tightened on the parchment's edge. It is binding statute, he corrected automatically. Eira looked up at him, and for the first time she saw the shape of fear beneath his sternness, cleanly contained, but real. How many? She asked, and she hated how small her voice sounded. Corven's gaze flicked toward the far wall as if counting shelves might be easier than answering. Enough, he said. I have lost, enough. Eira's throat burned. The idea of losing memories as punishment for mercy felt like the cruelest kind of order. And you're still here, she said, meaning, you're still yourself, somehow. Corven's mouth twitched, almost a smile, but it died before it could form. I am what remains. Eira's chest tightened. She wanted, fiercely, impulsively, to reach out and touch his hand, to offer some kind of comfort that wasn't words. But she didn't. She didn't know what touch meant to him. She didn't know what lines he had learned not to cross. So she offered something else. My boats don't coerce, she said, steadying her voice with purpose. They don't force anything. They're permission. People can hope without it becoming a weapon. Corven stared at the boats on the table, the tiny vessels gleaming faintly with their quiet shimmer. Permission, he murmured, and the word sounded like a forbidden luxury. Eira swallowed. If the hush feeds on suppression, she said, choosing each word carefully, then the laws. Do not speak treason in an archive annex, Corven said, sharply enough that Eira flinched. Then his expression tightened, and he lowered his voice. But continue. Eira's heart pounded. Then the laws might be feeding it, she finished, barely above a whisper. Corven's eyes closed for a moment. When he opened them, they were darker. I have had the same thought, he admitted, each word scraped out like it hurt. And every time I consider acting on it, I feel something, pull. Eira looked at the parchment again, the claws that stole memories. She could almost see the hook in it, sunk into his mind. You can't choose kindness without paying, she said. Corven's gaze snapped to hers, and for the first time anger flashed, hot, quick, and not directed at her, but at the reality of what she'd named. No, he said. I cannot. Silence fell again. The lamp flame flickered. Somewhere deeper in the building, water moved through the canals, and the sound of it through stone felt like a heartbeat. Eira's hands curled in her lap. Why did you bring me here? She asked, because the question mattered now more than ever. Corven stared at the boats. When he spoke, his voice was quieter. Because my disc did not flare, he said. Because the statutes say your work is illegal, yet the wards respond as if it is, balancing something. He paused, and the pause was the shape of a man stepping toward a ledge. And because if what you are doing is calming the hush, then arresting you would be enforcement of harm. Eira's breath caught at the honesty of it. And you can't enforce harm without losing yourself, she said softly. Corven's jaw clenched. I can enforce harm, he said. That is what I have been made to do. His gaze lifted to hers. I cannot enforce mercy. The words sat between them like a blade laid carefully on the table. Eira looked away first, because she couldn't bear the idea that the city had built a man into a weapon and called it virtue. Outside, through the small high window, fog moved. Lantern light smeared against it. Eira forced herself to focus on what she could do. If you can't permit illegal wishes, she said slowly, then don't. Don't permit them. Corven's brow furrowed. Explain. Eira's pulse steadied as her mind slid into the comfort of systems. Bureau work had trained her to think in clauses and categories, in loopholes and definitions. My wishes dissolve, she said. By dawn. There's no lingering enchantment. If the statutes define a wish as an intent binding that alters reality beyond the span of a sanctioned cycle, then these aren't. Corven's eyes narrowed. He reached for his law book without thinking. Show me the definition, he said. Eira felt a strange, fleeting thrill, not joy, exactly, but the sensation of her world shifting a fraction, as if a lock had loosened. Corven opened the law book to a marked page. His fingers moved quickly, familiar with the text. Unlicensed wishcraft, he read quietly, is defined as any unsanctioned act of intent binding designed to produce a material or emotional outcome within civic boundaries. Eira leaned in. Designed to produce, she said. Not designed to permit. Corven's gaze snapped to her. Eira's voice grew more certain. The boats aren't designed to produce a specific outcome, she said. They're designed to carry an expression of hope and break. If anything happens, it happens because people respond. Because the city responds. It's not a forced tilt. It's a release. Corven's eyes searched the text again, as if looking for the line that would allow him to believe her. He could not let himself smile. But the tension in his shoulders eased by a fraction, and Eira saw it like a small crack in a wall. Word games, Corven muttered. Law is word games, Eira said before she could stop herself. Corven's gaze lifted sharply, and for a second she thought she had offended him. Then, unbelievably, his mouth twitched. It was not a smile, not quite. But it was the closest thing to warmth she had seen on his face. It vanished quickly, but it left behind something in Eira's chest that felt both dangerous and bright. Corven cleared his throat and leaned back. If, he said, forcing himself into formal tone, your vessels can be argued as expressions rather than bindings, the charge becomes less direct. He looked at her. That does not make you safe. I wasn't safe the moment I started folding, Eira said softly. Corven's gaze held hers, steady and sharp. Then you must stop. Eira's hands tightened. And let the hush keep feeding. Corven's jaw worked. I did not say that. Eira waited, breath held. Corven looked away, his eyes dropping to the parchment oath again, the clause that threatened to erase him. For a long moment he said nothing. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. I cannot officially sanction your work, he said. I cannot witness it and allow it to continue without consequence. Eira's stomach sank. But, Corven continued, and the word was so quiet it barely existed, I can investigate the hush. Officially. I can follow reports. I can request access to old canal ward records. I can determine whether your vessels intersect with the pattern. Eira's heart pounded. With me. Corven's gaze flicked to her. You understand the vessels, he said. You have observed the canal response. You have patience. The last word came out almost unwilling. I would be foolish to ignore your insight. Eira stared at him, caught between relief and disbelief. Corven's voice hardened again. This is not partnership, he warned. This is controlled inquiry. You will do nothing without my knowledge. Eira flinched at the command and then saw the fear beneath it. Not fear of her, but fear of what might happen if she acted beyond his sight and forced him into a choice he could not pay for. So she nodded, slow. All right, she said. I'll be careful. Corven's gaze lingered on her face as if measuring whether she meant it. Then he took a breath, and the breath looked like someone swallowing a stone. I will file a preliminary note, he said, that the suspected violation is under technical review due to anomalous ward response. Eira's eyes widened. You'll delay it. Yes, Corven said, flat. Do not make me regret it. Eira's throat tightened with something like gratitude, too large to speak without cracking. She lowered her gaze quickly so he wouldn't see it in her eyes. Corven stood, suddenly restless. He moved to the small stove in the corner, more a heating charm box than a stove, and set a kettle on it with efficient motions. He opened a tin and poured in tea leaves. Eira blinked at him. You keep tea in an archive annex. Corven paused, the smallest hesitation. I work late, he said. The kettle began to hum. The sound filled the room with something almost domestic, so unfamiliar in bureau spaces that it felt like a trespass. Eira's hands were still cold from the canal damp. She tried not to watch Corven too closely, but her eyes kept catching on small details, the careful way he measured the leaves, the way his sleeves were buttoned like hers, the faint ink stain at the edge of one cuff as if even he could not escape paper entirely. Corven poured the tea into 2 cups without asking whether she wanted any. He slid one across the table toward her. Eira stared at it as if it might be a trap. It's tea, Corven said, dry. Not a confession. Eira's lips twitched despite herself. She wrapped her hands around the cup, and warmth seeped into her fingers, slow and real. Corven took his own cup but did not drink immediately. He watched her, eyes unreadable. Eira sipped. The tea was bitter and fragrant, like something meant to keep a person awake through too many nights. Your hands shake, Corven said. Eira nearly choked. They do not. Corven's gaze dipped to her fingers around the cup. They did when you wrote, he said. And when you were caught. Eira's cheeks heated. She set the cup down carefully to stop her hands from betraying her. I'm not used to being inspected. Corven's mouth tightened, as if the word struck him. No, he said softly. Most people aren't. For a moment, something in his expression shifted, an old weariness, a flicker of regret. Eira wondered, suddenly, how many nights he had walked people through fog and lamplight to rooms like this, how many lives he had quietly ruined because the statutes demanded it. You said you've lost enough, Eira said, barely above a whisper. Do you remember what you've lost? Corven's gaze went distant. Sometimes, he admitted. Sometimes I know there is a gap. Like a missing tooth with my tongue always finding it. Other times I don't know what I don't know. He swallowed. That is the worst part. Eira's chest tightened. She lifted her cup again, not to drink but to give her hands something to do. I'm sorry, she said, and the words felt too small, but they were honest. Corven's eyes snapped to hers, and for a moment he looked startled, almost offended by sympathy, as if he hadn't been offered it in years. Don't, he said, harsh enough that Eira flinched. Then his shoulders dropped slightly, and he closed his eyes for a beat, as if correcting himself. When he opened them, his voice was quieter. "Do not waste your softness on me," he said. "Softness is expensive in this city." Eira swallowed. "Maybe that's why we're losing it." Corven stared at her, and the silence stretched until Eira wanted to retreat into it. Outside, somewhere along the canal, a distant bell rang, a late-night signal for a lock change. The sound traveled through stone and water like a reminder of order. Corven set his cup down. "Tomorrow," he said, returning to the safer ground of planning, "you will go to work as usual. You will file as usual. You will not linger by the canals at night." Eira's stomach dropped. "Then how?" "I did not finish," Corven said, and something almost like amusement flickered again, quickly suppressed. "You will not linger alone." Eira stared at him. Corven's gaze held hers, steady. "I will accompany you," he said, as if the words tasted like iron. "As investigator." Not as, he cut himself off, jaw tightening, as if the idea of being anything else was both absurd and dangerous. Eira's pulse skittered. "People will see." "Yes," Corven said. "Which means you will behave like a clerk under scrutiny. And I will behave like an inspector doing his duty." Eira's throat tightened. "And the boats?" Corven's gaze dropped to the little vessels on the table. "We will test," he said. "Under controlled conditions. Near the canal wards. I will read the residue. We will map the hush response." He paused. "If it is real." "It's real," Eira whispered. Corven's eyes flicked to hers. "Then we will prove it," he said, and there was something fierce beneath his calm, like a blade finally drawn. Eira's hands tightened around her cup. Warmth seeped into her palms, and with it came a strange, cautious steadiness. She did not trust hope. Not in Vellune. But she could not ignore the thin bright thread of it that had appeared in this room, between a shy clerk and a cursed inspector. Corven rose and went to the door. He unlocked it and opened it slightly, peering out into the corridor to ensure it was empty. The hall beyond was dark. He stepped aside and gestured for her to go first. Eira stood, clutching her coat. She hesitated by the table, looking at the two tiny boats she had made in front of him. Leaving them here felt dangerous. Taking them felt worse. Corven noticed her hesitation. "Leave them," he said. "They will dissolve at dawn, even here." Eira frowned. "Without water?" Corven's eyes flicked to the dissolving sigils. "The sigil is tied to time, not current," he said, and the fact that he knew that made Eira's stomach flutter with a new kind of unease. "Dawn is a cycle. The vessels will break." Eira nodded slowly. She let the boats remain on the table like small white secrets. She stepped past Corven into the corridor. The air was colder here. The building's stone held the night like it held law. Corven followed, closing and locking the annex door behind them. The click sounded final, but his presence beside her no longer felt like a cage. They walked out together into the fog-laced street. The canal ran alongside them, dark and quiet. Eira looked at the water, searching for the pale thread. She could not see it now. Perhaps it hid when an inspector was near. Or perhaps, she thought with a strange ache, it hid when hope was not being suppressed. Corven spoke once, low and controlled, as they reached the corner where the city's lamps grew brighter. "If you betray this arrangement," he said, "I will have to do my duty." Eira nodded, her throat tight. "I know." Corven's gaze flicked to her face, as if checking for fear. Eira's voice came out steady anyway. "And if you don't," she said softly, "you might lose yourself." Corven's jaw clenched. They walked on, side by side, their footsteps measured, their shadows stretched long across damp stone. In the canal below, far beyond where their eyes could reach, a paper boat drifted through darkness carrying a wish that would dissolve by dawn, small, humble, and stubborn as a heartbeat. Morning in the registry hall arrived with the same practiced restraint as always, lamps turned down, windows wiped clear of night fog, the counter line forming before the bells had finished chiming. Eira took her seat at desk 9 with hands that wanted to shake and refused to, because shaking would be noticed and noticed meant questioned. She arranged her blotter, her ink, her stamps. She told her breathing to be small. Across the aisle, Lysant Wren glanced up from her own stack and froze for half a heartbeat. Corven Rooke stood behind Eira's desk. Not looming, Corven did not do anything so obvious, but present in a way the room could not pretend not to feel. His coat was buttoned. His satchel hung at his side. His eyes swept the hall once, taking in every face and every movement like he was reading a ledger only he could see. Eira's throat went dry. Lysant's gaze flicked from Corven to Eira, then back. One brow lifted again, sharper this time. "Are you alive?" it asked without words. Eira gave the smallest nod. Corven leaned slightly, his voice low enough that only she could hear. "Proceed as normal." "As normal," Eira whispered back. "Do not look at me," Corven added, almost as quietly. "If you look, they will." Eira kept her eyes on her blotter and reached for the first petition in her tray with fingers that were steadier than she deserved. The day's rhythm resumed. Stamps rose and fell. Pens scratched. The counter-clerks asked their questions in the usual cadence. But the room's air was different. People's eyes slid toward Corven and away again like birds avoiding a hawk. Even the caretaker moved more softly, as if sweeping too loudly might be a violation. Eira processed petitions with her spine straight and her face composed. Denied. 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 Each red mark felt heavier than it had the day before, because now she knew the weight of the statutes was not just on the citizens, it was on Corven too, hooked into his memory. At mid-morning, a petition reached her desk that made her pause. It was for a mood stabilizer charm. Approved, in small doses, when despair was clinically documented. The petitioner had attached 3 witness statements, 2 affidavits, and a certificate from a bureau-sanctioned healer. The request was from a tea vendor in the Canal district, Nessa Vell. Eira's throat tightened. She knew Nessa's stall. It was where Corven had given her tea as if warmth were not contraband. Eira glanced up, unable to stop herself. Corven's eyes were already on the petition. He did not frown. He did not show surprise. He simply held her gaze for a moment, and something unspoken passed between them. This is what the city has become, this is what we are up against. Eira looked back down and stamped the petition approved before she could talk herself out of it. Her hand trembled after the stamp hit paper. She steadied it by pressing her palm flat against the blotter until the shake subsided. Corven's voice, soft near her ear, held no reprimand. "You did your job," he said. Eira swallowed. "So did I yesterday," she whispered. Corven did not answer. At noon, Corven waited until the hall's bell chimed and clerks rose for their allotted breaks. He moved with the same careful timing, stepping close enough to be heard without being seen as conspiratorial. "Bring your lunch," he said quietly. "And your drafting graphite." Eira's heart jumped. "Where are we going?" Corven's gaze flicked toward the windows. "To look," he said. "Officially." Eira stood on unsteady legs and gathered her things. She felt the weight of every eye, even when no one stared directly. Lysant, passing by with her own tin lunchbox, brushed close enough to murmur under her breath without turning her head. "If you've been recruited into some scandal, at least have the decency to warn me," Lysant muttered. Eira's lips twitched faintly. "It's not a scandal," she whispered back, then immediately regretted it. Lysant's eyebrows rose. "That's what scandals say." Corven's gaze snapped toward Lysant with cool precision. Lysant, to her credit, did not flinch. She took a bite of her bread with exaggerated calm. Corven looked away first, but his jaw tightened as if he'd marked her down as a variable. Eira followed him out. They took a side corridor that led away from the registry hall's public spaces and down into stone that smelled of cold and damp. The bureau had levels like a beehive, offices above, storage below, and deeper still the places most clerks never saw unless they were carrying a stack of ledgers too heavy to lift alone. Corven's key opened doors without hesitation. Wards shimmered and recognized him. Each time a ward line softened to let them pass, Eira felt a little sick with the reminder of what his curse required, obedience that was not simply expected, but enforced. They emerged at last into a narrow walkway that ran beside a canal channel feeding under the bureau itself. The water here was darker, enclosed by stone, and the sound of it was louder without windows to muffle it. The air tasted faintly metallic. Corven crouched and set 3 calibrator beads on the stone ledge. He drew out his warding disc and held it over the water. "No boats yet," he said. Eira hugged her lunch to her chest and watched. The disc trembled, not with flair, but with a faint nervous pulse that reminded her of a heartbeat trying to calm itself. Corven's eyes narrowed as he tracked it. "There," he murmured. Eira followed his gaze to the water. At first she saw nothing. Then she saw it, a pale filament beneath the surface, drifting like a strand of fog trapped underwater. It moved with unnatural intent, not simply carried by current. Eira's stomach tightened. "The thread," she whispered. Corven's face was carved from control, but his eyes sharpened in a way that spoke of recognition, not rumor. "Yes." The filament rose slightly, pressing toward the surface as if sniffing at the air. The disc in Corven's hand pulsed faster. Eira's fingers clenched. "It's hungry," she said before she could stop herself. Corven did not correct her. He only said, "Fold." Eira set down her lunch and took out a scrap of petition paper from her inner pocket. Her hands were cold. She folded anyway, because folding was something her body could do even when fear made her mind clumsy. Crease. Turn. Tuck. Press. She wrote inside the hull with graphite, careful and small. "Let this water ease." She drew the dissolving sigil. She placed her fingers to the paper and breathed intent, soft, offered, not forced. The boat shimmered faintly. Corven's disc did not flare. Eira held the boat over the water, her pulse pounding. The pale filament drifted closer, drawn toward the vessel like an animal toward food. Eira lowered the boat onto the surface. It floated. The filament touched it. Eira's breath caught. Instead of wrapping and tightening, the filament loosened. It thinned, as if sighing. The water's surface rippled gently, not with agitation but with release. Corven's calibrator beads brightened in a soft, even glow. "Again," Corven said, but this time his voice held something different, not urgency alone, but the faint edge of awe he would never allow himself to name. Eira folded another boat. This one carried, "Let the city remember a small joy." She released it. The filament drifted after it, and where it passed, the water seemed to lighten by a fraction, as if someone had lifted a hand from the canal's mouth. Corven watched with a focus so intense Eira wondered if he was afraid to blink. When the second boat drifted out of reach, Corven finally straightened, his movements precise as if controlling his own body kept his thoughts from splintering. "This is not lash," he said, as if speaking into a court record. "This is not coercion. This is permission," Eira whispered. Corven's gaze flicked to her. "Do not romanticize it," he said automatically. Eira almost laughed. The absurdity of being warned not to romanticize a paper boat in the depths of a Bureau canal, she almost laughed. Corven saw it in her eyes and stiffened, as if laughter were a spark near dry parchment. Then, to her astonishment, the corner of his mouth moved. Not enough to be called a smile. Enough to be called human. He looked away immediately. Eira's chest ached. Corven gathered his beads and disc with quick efficiency. "We need records," he said. "Records of what?" Eira asked, lifting her lunch again as if it mattered. "Ward installations," Corven said. "Canal seals. Bright spill mitigation protocols. Anything that references residue behavior." Eira's stomach twisted. "Those are restricted." Corven's jaw tightened. "Yes." They returned upstairs by a different route, and Eira felt the shift in temperature and air like surfacing from underwater. By the time they re-entered public corridors, Corven's face had reset into inspector neutrality. Eira's own expression settled into clerk calm. They did not speak in the hallways. They did not look at each other unless necessary. If anyone watched, they saw an inspector escorting a clerk for administrative inquiry. Only when Corven pushed open a heavy door labeled Internal Archives, Statutory Development did Eira realize how far he was willing to go. Inside, the air was drier, and the shelves were older. Here the books were bound in leather cracked like riverbeds, and the ledgers wore the dust of decades. A long desk ran beneath a row of narrow windows that admitted thin light. 2 elderly archivists sat at the far end, heads bent over parchment. Corven approached with measured steps. Inspector Rooke, one archivist said without looking up. His voice held no warmth, only acknowledgement. Corven produced his authorization seal. I require access to Brightspillera Canal ward records, he said. The second archivist finally raised his head. His eyes were pale and tired. Those are sealed. Corven's voice remained calm. I am aware. Sealed by the architect legate, the archivist added, and the name landed heavy in the air. Corven's jaw flexed. Then I require a sealed access petition. The archivist's gaze slid to Eira, dismissive. A clerk. Corven's eyes did not move. An assistant, he said, and Eira's heart did something foolishly bright at the word. The archivist made a sound that was almost a snort. He slid a form across the desk with 2 fingers as if pushing away something unpleasant. Petition for sealed access, he said. Submit. Wait for denial. Corven did not react. He took the form. He moved to the long desk near the windows and set it down. Eira stood beside him, hands clasped, unsure whether she was allowed to breathe. Corven began to write. His handwriting was precise and severe. Clause by clause, he framed the request as statutory necessity, anomaly in canal ward response, potential civic stability threat, urgent review required. He did not mention paper boats. He did not mention hush threads. He wrote the truth in the language the Bureau could not easily refuse without admitting negligence. Eira watched him write and saw, beneath the control, a kind of anger that had nowhere safe to go. When he finished, Corven slid the form to Eira. Add your observation, he said quietly. In clerk terms. Eira's throat tightened. Me? Corven's gaze held hers. You have seen the symptoms, he said. Write what you have witnessed. Do not embellish. Do not their eyes. Eira sat and took the graphite stub from her pocket. Her hands trembled as she wrote, but her words came clear. In the past 6 weeks, increased reports of citizens forgetting minor personal details, visible emotional flattening, diminished spontaneous laughter, petitions for mood stabilization and sleep wards increased, canal surface anomalies observed, pale filament-like movement, coinciding with reported hush symptoms. She kept it clinical. She kept it honest. When she slid the form back, Corven's eyes scanned her addition. Something in his gaze softened, not approval exactly, but the recognition of shared purpose. He took the petition to the archivists. The pale-eyed archivist stamped received with dull inevitability and set it into a tray already heavy with forgotten requests. Corven's face did not change. Eira's hope tried to rise and was pressed down by reality. They'll deny it, she whispered when they were back in the corridor. Corven's voice was low. Yes. Eira's stomach dropped. Then what? Corven's gaze fixed ahead, sharp and distant, like a man staring at a wall he intended to break without using his fists. Then we find another way, he said. They left the Bureau for the rest of the day under the guise of field inquiry, Corven's seal opening gates along the canal district that Eira had never seen up close in daylight. The city here was narrower, older, its stone damp and its air thick with the smell of waterweed and frying onions. People moved slowly, shoulders hunched, faces dull. At the locks, Bramquill stood with a wrench in one hand and a ledger in the other, arguing with a younger warden about a jammed gate. Bram turned when he heard Corven's footsteps and stiffened. His expression soured instantly, like milk turning. Inspector, Bram said, not bothering to hide his dislike. Come to measure my joy by inch. Corven ignored the insult with practiced ease. Warden Quill, he replied. I am conducting inquiry into canal anomalies. Bram snorted. Anomalies? That what you call it when the water feels like it wants to swallow the light? Eira's breath caught. Bram had words for it too. Corven's gaze sharpened. You have observed changes, he said. Bram's eyes flicked to Eira. His expression softened a fraction when he recognized her. The clerk, he said. Paper folding one. Eira's cheeks warmed. Hello, she murmured. Bram jerked his chin toward the canal. I've seen your little boats, he said bluntly. They drift past my locks and the water stops feeling wrong for a while. He looked back at Corven, eyes narrowing. You here to stop her? Corven's jaw tightened. I am here to understand what is happening, he said. Bram laughed without humor. Understanding won't keep people from going blank-eyed, he snapped. My neighbor forgot her wedding day yesterday. Forgot it like it never happened. She didn't even cry. Just shrugged. That's what scares me. Eira's throat burned. She wanted to say something comforting, but comfort without action felt useless. Corven stared at the canal, and for a moment his face looked older than it had in the bureau, drawn tight by a burden he could not set down. Then he said, carefully, show me where it is worst. Bram hesitated, surprised by the request. Then he waved them along with a curt gesture. Nettle Street, he said. By the old spillway. New wards went up there yesterday. His mouth twisted. Bureau says it'll stabilize. It's making people thinner. Eira's pulse spiked. New wards. That was Vale's hand. They walked with Bram through narrow streets toward Nettle Street, where a line of iron ward posts had been hammered into the stone along the canal edge. Each post was etched with bureau sigils, the lines sharp and cold, meant to compress and contain. Eira felt the air shift as they neared, heavier, like standing under a low ceiling. Even the lanterns seemed dimmer. A woman stood outside a bakery with her arms folded tightly over her chest, staring at her own hands as if trying to remember what they were for. Inside, the display shelves were half empty. The smell of bread was faint, wrong. Eira's stomach clenched. This is the hush, Bram said, voice rough. Right here. Corven's warding disc pulsed violently the moment he drew it out, not flaring in accusation but trembling with strain, like a compass near a magnet. Eira stared at the canal. The pale filament was not one thread here. It was many, tangled beneath the surface like a net. Her skin prickled. Bram's voice dropped. Tell me you can do something, he said, and there was no pride left in him, only fear. Eira's hands shook. She reached into her pocket for paper. Corven's voice cut in, low and sharp. Careful, he warned. Eira looked at him, heart pounding. If we don't, Corven's jaw tightened. If you do too much, too fast, it could lash, he said, the words forced through discipline. Your restraint is why it works. Eira swallowed. She forced her breathing to slow. She folded with precision, not frenzy. One boat. Then another. Then a third. Each wish she wrote was small and clean, permission rather than demand. Let the baker remember why she sings. Let the air feel lighter by dusk. Let the water loosen its grip. She drew dissolving sigils on each. She breathed intent with care, feeling the cost as a gentle pull at the center of her chest, tiredness, not pain. Honest effort. She set the first boat on the canal. The tangled filaments beneath the surface surged toward it, hungry as a storm. Eira's breath caught. The boat drifted, a tiny pale thing against dark water. The filaments touched it. And then, slowly, they thinned. Not disappearing. Not defeated. But easing, loosening their knot as if something in them had remembered another way to exist. The air above the canal shifted. It was subtle, but Eira felt it, a fraction of pressure released. A sound came from the bakery, soft, surprised. A hum. A tune searching for itself. The woman outside blinked, as if waking from a fog, and turned her head toward the bakery door. Her face moved with confusion, then with something like recognition. Bram sucked in a breath. By the locks, he whispered. Corven watched, rigid with focus. His disc steadied. The calibrator bead he'd placed on the stone brightened with a gentle, even glow. Eira released the second boat. The third. The filaments continued to thin, the water's surface rippling more naturally. The lantern light seemed to sharpen, less smeared. Inside the bakery, the hum turned into a soft, shaky laugh as if the baker had startled herself with sound. Eira's eyes stung. Corven's voice came quiet at her shoulder. You were right, he said. Eira turned her head slightly, stunned by the admission. Corven's gaze stayed on the canal. The wards are compressing something, he said, each word careful. And compression is feeding it. Eira's heart hammered. Then the bureau. Corven's jaw clenched. He did not finish. He did not need to. The conclusion sat between them like a verdict. Bram looked between them, eyes narrowed. So what now? He demanded. You file a form while people go hollow? Corven's gaze flicked to Bram, and for a moment the stern inspector was there, controlled, unyielding. But beneath it, Eira saw something else, a man with a knife at his own mind, being asked to cut the rope that held him together. Corven's voice, when it came, was low. Now we prove it, he said. Eira's pulse steadied into something like resolve. How? Corven looked toward the ward posts, the bureau sigils cold on iron. We need bright Spillera protocols, he said. We need to know what was sealed, and how. His eyes narrowed. And we need to know who wrote the seals that bind the city and me. Eira's stomach tightened at the last word. Corven finally looked at her directly. His eyes were steady, but something vulnerable flickered behind them, fear, yes, and also a kind of yearning he would not name. If we proceed, he said quietly, there will be consequences. Eira swallowed hard. For me. And for me, Corven said, voice tight. Eira's chest ached. She wanted to tell him not to do it. To protect himself. To keep what remained. But she looked at the canal instead, at the filaments still lingering under the surface like a sickness waiting for suppression to return. She looked at the bakery door, where the woman now stood with her hand pressed to the frame as if anchoring herself to something real. Softness is expensive in this city, Corven had said. Eira lifted her chin. Then we spend it carefully, she whispered. For a moment, Corven's gaze held hers, and the space between them felt charged, not with anything explicit, but with trust forming like a bridge plank by plank. Then Corven nodded once, the motion small and final. Tomorrow, he said, the petition will be denied. Eira's stomach dropped, even though she had known. Corven's eyes hardened. And tomorrow night, he continued, we will go to the deeper archives. Eira stared. Those are sealed by Ward. Corven's jaw tightened. Yes. Bram muttered something rough and disbelieving. You're going to break in. Corven's gaze snapped toward Bram, sharp enough to cut. No, he said. I am going to retrieve evidence of a civic threat that the Bureau is ignoring. Bram barked a laugh. That's what breaking in is when you wear a coat. Corven did not answer. Eira's hands curled in her coat pockets around the last scrap of paper she had unfolded. She could feel its edge, thin and sharp. Corven, she said softly, and it was the first time she had used his name without being forced to. His eyes flicked to her. The briefest pause, an acknowledgement that names mattered. Eira's voice trembled but held. If you're bind. Corven's jaw clenched, but he did not interrupt. Eira swallowed. If it pulls when you allow mercy, she said, what happens when you do this? Corven's gaze went distant for a fraction of a second, as if he had already felt the answer waiting like teeth. Then he looked back at her, and his voice came out very controlled. Then I will lose something, he said. And we will keep going anyway. The words struck Eira's chest like a stone and a vow at the same time. They stood by the canal as the last of her boats drifted out of sight, their paper bodies carrying small permissions through dark water that did not know how to be gentle anymore. Above them, the ward posts hummed with cold law. Below, the filaments thinned but did not vanish. And in the space between a shy clerk and a cursed inspector, a plan took shape, dangerous, precise, and held together by the kind of trust that felt, in Vellune, like the most illegal wish of all. The denial arrived on clean paper, stamped in a hand that looked bored. Eira saw it before she sat down. Her morning stack at desk 9 included an internal memo, folded and sealed with a narrow strip of bureau wax. She broke the seal with a careful fingernail and read the lines once, then again, as if repetition might change ink. Sealed access petition, denied. Reason, unnecessary. Canal wards function within acceptable parameters. Signed, Office of the Architect Legate. Eira's throat tightened until it hurt to swallow. Across the aisle, Lysant Wren watched Eira's face and went still. Lysant had learned to read the Bureau's emotional grammar. A denial made the mouth flatten, a threat made the eyes go too wide. Eira folded the memo and slid it into her inner pocket like contraband. Corven stood behind her chair, silent. He had not moved from his position since the first bell. He read the room and the paper with the same cold precision. Eira kept her eyes on her blotter. It's denied, she whispered without looking. I expected that, Corven murmured. You expected them to ignore us. I expected him to ignore us, Corven corrected. Eira's fingers tightened around her stamp. The day's first petition lay open on her blotter, a request for a child's fever ward, modest, urgent. The petitioner had written in shaky letters, please. He is too small to keep shaking. Eira swallowed down the ache and stamped approved with a force that made her wrist sting. Corven's voice was quiet near her ear. Good. Eira stared at the red mark. She wanted to ask how long they could keep doing this, approving tiny mercies while the city hollowed out around them. She wanted to ask what it meant that an architect legate could dismiss evidence without looking. She did not ask. She did not dare. The registry hall was tighter today, as if the air itself had been told to behave. Clerks spoke less. Petitioners looked more nervous. Even the mural of the old golden canals seemed dimmer, as if the paint had been drained overnight. At midday, the counter line did not thin. A murmur of unrest moved through it, small, frustrated breaths, the scrape of boots, a woman snapping at her husband to stop fidgeting. A boy near the back rubbed his temples as if trying to force his own thoughts into place. Eira stamped denial after denial, each one feeling like feeding an unseen mouth. By late afternoon, a runner arrived with a rolled ordinance sealed in dark wax. He handed it directly to the counter supervisor, who unrolled it with a pale face. The supervisor's voice, when she read it aloud, had the flat ring of someone reciting a sentence. Emergency measure, she said. By order of the architect legate Mordren Vale. Effective immediately. Enactment of the joyless lock. A hush fell over the registry hall, so complete that Eira heard the faint drip of water in a distant pipe. The supervisor continued, voice shaking slightly. All spontaneous wishcraft is prohibited under emergency threat conditions. All non-essential enchantments are suspended. Civic mood stabilization wards will be activated district-wide. Unauthorized expressions of hope are subject to investigation. The line at the counter shifted uneasily. Eira's mouth went dry. She felt Corven behind her go rigid, like a blade locked into its sheath. Lysant muttered under her breath, not quite to Eira and not quite to herself, he's going to squeeze the whole city until it snaps. Corven's head turned a fraction, sharp. Lysant pretended she hadn't spoken. Eira's hands went cold. The joyless lock would compress everything, every stray longing, every private bright thought, into the canals and the stones and the bodies of the people who could not afford to stop wanting. It would feed the hush until it became a feast. Corven's voice dropped, barely a breath. Tonight, he said. We go. Eira's heart kicked hard. Tonight, she echoed. When the hall finally emptied, it did not do so with relief. It emptied with quiet fear. Eira waited until the caretaker had passed, until the wards had shimmered and sealed, until the last echo of footsteps had died. She moved like a shadow, packing her coat, her graphite, the scraps of petition paper she had already hidden. Her stomach felt like it held stones. Corven appeared at her desk as if he had been standing in the wall all along. He wore the same coat, the same satchel. But his eyes were darker now, fixed on something only he could see. Stay close, he said. Eira nodded. They left through the side door and slipped into the evening fog. The city's lamps were lit, but the light seemed wrong, thin, strained, as if the flame itself was tired. Along the canal walk, the air carried a faint hum, like a low chord held too long. Do you feel that? Eira whispered. Corven's jaw tightened. The lock is activating. They moved through streets that had always been subdued at night and now felt like they were holding their breath. A tavern door stood open, but no laughter spilled out. A couple walked past Eira with their shoulders turned inward, their hands not touching. Eira's chest tightened with anger she did not know she had. Corven led her to the bureau's older wing, the section built closest to the canals, where the stone was darker and the corridor lamps were fewer. Here, the walls were carved with old sigils that had been worn smooth by time and law. A sealed door waited at the end of a narrow passage. It was not labeled. It did not need to be. The air around it was different, thicker, warded, with a pressure that made Eira's teeth ache. Corven took out his brass disc and held it near the door. The disc pulsed violently. Eira's breath caught. It's feeding already. Corven's gaze flicked to her. No, he said, voice tight. It's resisting. He set his satchel on the floor, opened it, and withdrew not just beads and scripts, but a thin, flexible strip of parchment marked with legal calligraphy. Eira recognized the style instantly, statute spell. Her eyes widened. Where did you? Corven did not look at her. From my own bind, he said. Eira's stomach dropped. You tore it. I copied a clause, Corven corrected, precise even now. A clause that grants access to sealed records under immediate civic threat conditions. His voice went flatter. The architect legate forgets that law binds him too. Eira's hands trembled. Will it work? It will work, Corven said, and the certainty in his tone sounded less like confidence and more like necessity. He pressed the parchment strip to the door and spoke a sequence of numbers under his breath, the syllables clipped and cold. The ward shimmered, tightened, then, reluctantly, loosened like a fist unclenching. The door's lock clicked. Eira's heart hammered so hard she felt it in her throat. Corven's hand hovered near the handle for a fraction of a second, and Eira saw the strain in his fingers, as if touching the door was like touching a line he had sworn never to cross. Then he turned the handle. The door opened. Cold air spilled out, smelling of water and old stone. The darkness beyond was thick, not just unlit but weighted, as if it carried centuries of sealed intent. Corven stepped in first. Eira followed, the door closing behind them with a soft finality. They descended narrow stairs cut into the limestone, the steps worn at the edges. A lantern hung from Corven's hand, its flame warded to burn steady. The light did not feel warm, it felt like a thing struggling to exist. Below, the corridor opened into a cavernous archive chamber. Shelves rose like cliffs, packed with bound volumes and sealed boxes. Some of the boxes bore old wax seals stamped with the earliest bureau insignia, less polished, more jagged, like the city's laws had once been sharper because they were newer. The canals ran here too, but not openly. Eira could hear water beneath the stone floor, a low continuous sound like a breath forced through clenched teeth. Corven moved quickly but carefully, as if every step was a line of text he did not want to misread. He did not touch shelves unnecessarily. He did not let his lantern sway too much. Eira's gaze darted across labels until her eyes snagged on a row marked BRIGHTS PALELT containment protocols. Her mouth went dry. There. Corven's eyes followed. He approached, drew out a key ring, older keys, heavier, and unlocked a cabinet with grim efficiency. Inside were ledgers wrapped in oilcloth, their covers stamped with warning sigils that made Eira's skin prickle. Corven pulled one out and opened it on a stone table. The first pages were reports, dates, districts, casualty counts written in the dull language of administration. Eira read lines that made her stomach twist, mentions of people who laughed for hours until their lungs failed, and of others who lost all desire and stopped eating, and of canal waters brightening into something that burned skin like acid. Corven turned pages faster, eyes scanning. Containment, he murmured. Containment, Eira leaned closer. Her fingers hovered over the paper without touching. She saw it then, a set of diagrams, canal maps overlaid with ward lines and statute sigils, all converging on a point beneath the city. The seal is in the canals, Eira whispered. Corven's jaw tightened. Yes. Eira's breath went shallow. They didn't just outlaw wishcraft, she said, the understanding forming like ice. They built the law to keep the seal fed. Corven's eyes snapped to hers, sharp. Eira forced herself to keep reading. A passage referenced residual sentience, hope saturation, and a phrase that made Eira's stomach flip, suppression as stabilizer. It feeds on suppression, Eira whispered, voice breaking. Corven's face went still in a way that frightened her. He turned another page, and there, in the margin of a founding statute draft, was a signature. Mordren Vale. Not as architect legate, those titles were newer, but as counsel Vale, junior lawweaver. His hand had been part of the original sealwork. Eira's throat burned. He knows, she breathed. He's always known. Corven's fingers tightened on the edge of the ledger until the leather creaked. For a moment, he did not look like an inspector. He looked like a man who had been betrayed by the thing he had devoted himself to. The canal sound beneath their feet deepened. The lantern flame trembled. Eira's gaze snapped toward the floor. The stone seemed to darken as if shadow were leaking up from the seams. Corven's warding disc pulsed hard in his pocket, visible even through cloth, like a trapped heartbeat. The lock, Corven said, voice low and urgent. It's compressing the city's hope into the seal. Eira's breath came short. It's going to surge. Corven shoved the ledger toward her. Copy the relevant pages, he said. Now. Eira's hands shook as she pulled out her graphite and scrap paper. She began to sketch the canal diagram and key lines of text, forcing her mind into the safe shape of work. Her fingers smudged graphite. The words blurred through fear. Above them, somewhere far away, the city groaned under invisible pressure. The canal sound beneath their feet changed, less like a breath now, more like a low hungry sigh. Eira's throat tightened. Corven, she whispered. Corven had gone very still. His eyes were fixed on the ward lines in the diagram as if seeing something else layered beneath it. Do you feel the pull? Eira asked, her voice trembling. Corven's jaw clenched. Yes. Eira's chest tightened. Because we're doing this. Corven did not answer immediately. His gaze flicked to the door they had come through, then to the shelves, then back to the ledger. I am allowing unlawful access, he said, and his voice sounded like it was being squeezed through a vice. My bind. He stopped. His hand rose to his temple, fingers pressing hard, as if trying to hold something in place. Eira froze, graphite still in her grip. Corven. Corven's breathing went shallow. His eyes unfocused for a heartbeat, then sharpened again, but with a new edge of panic he could not fully bury. It's taking, he started, then stopped, swallowing. Eira stood so quickly her chair scraped. What is it taking? Corven stared at her as if searching for the answer in her face. His mouth opened, closed, then opened again. His voice faltered, then steadied with brutal effort. I forgot, he said. Eira's stomach dropped. Forgot what? Corven's gaze flicked away, as if the thing he'd lost had been a place he could no longer look at. A name, he said tightly. A name that mattered. Eira's throat burned. She stepped closer without thinking, then stopped herself a breath away from him, afraid of crossing a line he might not be able to bear. Corven's eyes lifted to hers. In them, Eira saw fear stripped of armor, fear of vanishing one piece at a time. I can't, Corven's voice roughened. He swallowed. I can't afford to lose more. Eira's hands shook. She wanted to say then stop. Leave. Protect yourself. But the canal beneath them surged with a sound like water being drawn into a throat. Eira turned toward the stone floor. Dark threads were rising now, not visible like the canal filaments in daylight, but felt, sensed, like cold fingers reaching up through cracks. The air in the archive chamber grew heavier, pressing against lungs. The hush is here, Eira whispered, dread sharp. It's in the seal. Corven's face tightened. It's waking. Eira looked at the pages she had copied, half-finished, smudged. We need more time. We don't have it, Corven said. A soft sound echoed through the chamber, then a distant, slow pulse, as if something beneath the stone had shifted in its sleep and turned its attention toward them. Eira's skin prickled. Corven grabbed the ledger, yanked free the pages he needed most, diagram, statute draft, margin signatures, and stuffed them into his satchel. Eira's breath caught at the violence of the act. Tearing pages from a sealed ledger was not just unlawful. It was sacrilege. But Corven's eyes were fixed and fierce now. We will return these to daylight, he said. Or this city will choke in the dark. Eira clutched her own scraps and shoved them into her coat. Corven, she said, voice tight, we have to go. Corven nodded once. He reached for the door. And the ward shimmered. It did not loosen this time. It tightened, snapping shut like a jaw. Corven's curse-pulled claws had gotten them in. The lock, feeding the seal, was now reacting, reinforcing every boundary. Corven pressed his palm to the door, jaw clenched. He murmured the access sequence again. The ward flared, not in accusation, but in resistance. Eira's breath hitched. It's blocking us. Corven's voice went harsh. Yes. Behind them, the air thickened further. Eira felt it in her bones, The hush's hunger, the pressure of all the city's swallowed hopes pressed down into one place, now finding a new shape to feed. Eira's hands shook. She looked at the shelves, at paper and law and sealed truth. If it feeds on suppression, she whispered, then the only thing that starves it is permission. Corven's eyes snapped to her. Eira's pulse hammered. My boats, she said. Here. Corven's jaw tightened. Not here, he said quickly. Not in this chamber. Too much residue. Too close to the seal. It could. Then small, Eira insisted, forcing her voice steady. Humble. Not a demand. Corven stared at her as if weighing risk against necessity. His bind had already taken something. The seal was waking. They were trapped in a chamber of paper and law beneath a city being squeezed. Finally, Corven nodded once, tight. Eira ripped a small scrap of petition paper with trembling fingers. She folded as quickly as she dared, crease, turn, tuck, press, her hands clumsy with fear but guided by muscle memory. She wrote inside the hull, the graphite line pressing hard. Let this door remember how to open. She drew the dissolving sigil. Her breath shook as she poured intent into it, not force, not command, but permission offered to stone and ward and lock. You may release. She set the boat on the stone floor near the sealed door. It looked absurd there, a tiny pale thing in a cavern of law. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then Corven's warding disc, still pressed against the door, steadied. The ward shimmered, its lines wavering as if confused by gentleness in a place that only understood force. The air shifted. The pressure eased by a fraction. The lock clicked. Eira's breath broke free in a gasp. Corven did not waste the moment. He yanked the door open and pulled Eira through. They ran up the narrow stairs, lantern light swinging wildly now, shadows leaping on stone. Behind them, the archive chamber's air thickened again, and Eira felt the hush reach after them with cold hunger, as if offended that they had slipped free. They burst into the upper corridor, and Corven slammed the door shut. He pressed his palm to it and spoke a sealing phrase, not to lock it for the Bureau, but to lock it against what was rising below. The ward shimmered, held. For a moment they stood there, breathing hard in the dim corridor. Eira's lungs burned. Her hands shook so badly she had to press them against her coat to steady them. Corven's face was pale in the lantern light. He looked down at his own hand as if expecting it to have disappeared. Eira forced herself to look at him. What did you lose? She whispered. Corven swallowed. His voice came out rougher than she'd ever heard it. A kindness, he said, and the words made no sense until he blinked, hard. He stopped, his throat working. I can't remember who used to call me by something softer. Eira's chest tightened painfully. She could almost see the missing piece, like a gap where warmth had lived. I'm sorry, she whispered again, hating the smallness of it. Corven's eyes snapped to hers, and for once he did not tell her not to. His gaze held hers too long, too raw, and Eira felt something dangerous shift between them, not desire spoken aloud, not anything explicit, but the deep aching awareness that if the city could steal a name from him, it could steal anything. Corven looked away first, jaw clenched like a man holding himself together by force. We have evidence, he said, voice tight. We have proof of Vale's involvement. We have proof the lock is feeding the seal. Eira's hands curled around her smudged scraps of notes in her pocket. Then we take it to the man who denied the petition. Corven's voice cut in, sharp with bitter humor. He will bury it. Eira's stomach dropped. She knew he was right. Corven's gaze went distant, calculating. We need witnesses, he said. We need undeniable demonstration. Eira's pulse spiked. A public hearing? Corven's jaw tightened. If we can force one. Eira's throat went dry. How? Corven did not answer immediately. He stared down the corridor toward the registry hall above, toward the city beyond, toward the canals humming with compressed hope. Then he said, very quietly, we make the city feel the difference. Eira's heart hammered. With boats. With controlled vessels, Corven corrected automatically, then stopped as if the formality had become too brittle. His voice lowered further. With permission. In daylight. Where it cannot be called secret contamination. Eira's breath came shallow. They'll stop us. Corven's eyes flicked to hers, steady and grim. Yes. Eira swallowed hard. And you're bind. Corven's jaw clenched. We'll pull, he said. It already has. Eira felt tears sting, hot and unwanted. She blinked them back fiercely. Corven, she whispered, and his name tasted like a vow she was not allowed to make. He looked at her again, and in his eyes there was something like surrender, not to weakness, but to the truth that he could not stay whole by obeying a system that was killing the city. We do this carefully, he said, voice low. We do not flood the canals. We do not incite mass wishing. We prove that lawful permission starves the hush. Eira nodded, throat tight. And if they arrest me? Corven's gaze sharpened. Then I will do everything within statute to stop it, he said. And if statute isn't enough? Eira asked, her voice trembling. Corven's face went very still. Then, he said quietly, I will decide what I am willing to forget. The words landed like a weight and a warmth at once. Eira's breath caught. She wanted to say don't. She wanted to say I won't let you. But she had no authority over his curse, no power over the Bureau's cruelty, only her paper and her small stubborn permission. So she nodded, because nodding was all she could do without breaking. They moved through the Bureau like ghosts, careful not to be seen. When they slipped out into the night, the city's air felt heavier than before. The joyless lock had spread. People's faces in the streets looked flatter, their eyes dulled. The canals hummed with strained containment. Eira's fingers brushed the hidden scraps in her pocket, and she felt the thin edges of paper like a promise and a blade. Above them, lanterns burned thinly. Below them, in the sealed dark under the bureau, something hungry shifted and listened. And in Corven's satchel, torn pages rustled softly, proof that law had been used not to protect hope, but to feed on its absence. By the time they reached the canal district, the water looked wrong again. Not just dark, but thick, like it did not want to move. Eira stood at the edge and watched the surface, her heart pounding. Corven stopped beside her, his posture rigid. He did not touch her. He did not need to. The space between them was charged enough. We start tomorrow, he said. Eira swallowed. Tomorrow, she echoed. Corven's voice dropped, quiet as a confession he would never write on paper. Go home, he said. Sleep if you can. Eira's lips parted with a question she didn't know how to ask. Will you be all right? But she didn't ask. She only nodded. As she turned away, she heard Corven behind her, very softly, as if speaking to himself or to the canal or to the part of him that was already missing. Remember, he said. Eira stopped, breath caught. Corven did not look at her. His gaze stayed on the water. His voice was tight. I need to remember why I chose this, he said. Eira's chest ached. She turned back just enough to speak without being seen doing it. Then let me be the reason you can, she whispered. Corven went still. For a moment, Eira thought she had crossed a line he could not bear. Then Corven's head dipped once, a small motion, not approval, not promise, but acknowledgement. As if her words had found a place to rest in him where the curse could not immediately reach. Eira walked away through fog and thin lamplight, her hands shaking and her heart burning, knowing that morning would bring confrontation, and that hope, once secret on paper, was about to be dragged into the open. Dawn came to Vellune like a cautious visitor. The joyless lock had been active all night, and the city wore it the way it wore winter, quietly, with shoulders hunched, with mouths pressed into thin lines. The canal water looked heavier in morning light, as if it had swallowed too much and could not digest. Eira walked to the bureau with her coat buttoned high, her pocket weighted with petition scraps she had saved in secret for weeks. The paper edges pressed against her ribs with each breath, sharp reminders that she was about to do something she could not undo. Corven met her at the side door, exactly where he said he would. He looked as if he hadn't slept. The shadows under his eyes were darker, and his posture was too precise, like sleep might have made him vulnerable and he could not afford vulnerability. But his gaze held steady when it met hers. Ready, he said, not a question. Eira swallowed. No, she admitted. But I'm here. Corven's jaw tightened, and something unreadable, gratitude, perhaps, or fear, flickered behind his eyes. He looked away first, as if looking too long would become a kind of warmth neither of them could safely carry. They entered the bureau together. The registry hall was already full. The counter line stretched longer than usual, and the air felt thick with unspoken frustration. People clutched petitions in stiff hands. The mural of the old golden canals looked like a cruel joke. Eira sat at desk 9 and began processing the morning stack. Her stamp rose and fell. Approved for fever wards, for mold seals, for a heating charm in a tenement where children slept in coats. Denied for anything that smelled like joy, anything that could be called a wish. The joyless lock had made the rules even narrower. Even approved enchantments felt brittle, stripped of any softness that wasn't strictly utilitarian. Corven stood behind her like a shadow with authority. When the clock chimed mid-morning, a bell rang in the far corridor, 3 strikes, not 2. An uncommon signal. Eira looked up before she could stop herself. Across the hall, the main doors opened, and a group of senior officials entered with careful ceremony. Their robes were darker than the clerks' coats, their collars stitched with law sigils. At their center walked a tall man whose presence pulled the room inward. Architect Legate Mordren Vale. Eira recognized him from the few times she had seen him at a distance, silver hair pulled back neatly, face composed as if carved from polished stone. His eyes were pale and unhurried, like winter sunlight that never warms. The counter supervisors straightened. The petitioners fell quieter. Even the lamplight seemed to sharpen. Vale moved through the registry hall as if it belonged to him the way lungs belonged to a body. He stopped near the mural and looked at it with mild distaste, as if old joy were an aesthetic flaw. He spoke without raising his voice. Civic stability, he said, and the words carried anyway, is not maintained by sentiment. Eira's stomach tightened. Vale's gaze swept over the desks. It landed briefly on Corven. Inspector Rooke, Vale said, voice smooth. A word. Corven's posture did not change, but Eira felt it like a wire drawn tight. Corven stepped away from her desk and approached Vale with the controlled obedience of someone walking into a trap he already understands. Eira kept stamping, because stopping would be noticed. But her attention stretched toward them, taut. Vale's voice was low, meant to be private, yet the hall's hush made every syllable feel audible. You filed a petition for sealed access, Vale said. It was denied. Corven's voice was formal. Yes, Architect Legate. And yet, Vale continued, I hear rumors of your interest in canal behavior. Interest best left to the ward rights. Corven's jaw tightened. My duty is to investigate potential civic threats. Vale's smile was thin. Your duty, he said softly, is to enforce. Not to question the nature of enforcement. Eira's stamp hit paper too hard. Thump. The sound echoed in her ears. Vale's gaze remained on Corven. The joyless lock is necessary, he said. It will hold. Corven's voice was controlled. It is feeding the hush. Silence sharpened. Eira's breath caught. Corven had said it aloud. Vale did not blink. He only looked at Corven as if considering whether he was worth correcting. The hush, Vale said, almost kindly, is what happens when people are allowed to want without restraint. It is the echo of the bright spill. It will pass when the city learns obedience again. Corven's jaw worked, as if he were biting down on anger. It is not passing, he said. Vale's tone remained gentle, which somehow made it worse. Inspector, he said, I have always respected your integrity. Your bind assures it. Eira's stomach dropped. The way Vale said bind made her skin crawl, like someone stroking a leash. Vale's eyes flicked toward Eira's desk, then back to Corven. A shy clerk, he murmured. A tender-hearted nuisance. Do not be led into foolishness by softness. Eira's face burned, but she kept her eyes on her blotter. Corven's voice, low and deadly calm, said, softness is not the threat. Suppression is. For a heartbeat, Vale's smile faltered. Then it returned, smoother than before. You are tired, Vale said. Return to your duties. I will assign you to oversee joyless lock compliance in the Canal District. Eira's chest tightened. The Canal District. The place where the hush was worst. Vale wasn't just redirecting Corven, he was positioning him. Corven bowed his head fractionally, a gesture of formal acknowledgement that tasted like poison. As you command. Vale began to turn away, satisfied, already moving on to address the supervisors. Corven's gaze flicked, quick, sharp, to Eira. It was not a look of instruction. It was a look of decision. Eira's pulse slammed. Corven stepped back toward her desk with measured calm. Vale's attention had shifted to the counter line. The room's eyes followed Vale, not Corven. Corven leaned close enough that his voice was a breath against Eira's ear. Now, he said. Eira's hands went numb. Corven's fingers brushed the underside of her desk, one quick motion, unseen by anyone but her, and something small slid into her palm. A bureau seal. Not the ordinary registry stamp, but the inspector's field authorization seal, heavy, metal, warm from his hand. Eira stared down at it in disbelief. Corven's voice was barely audible. You will request a public hearing, he murmured. Under civic threat demonstration protocol. Eira's heart hammered. That requires an authorized seal, Corven said. And a witness. Eira looked up. Corven's gaze held hers, steady and grim. I am your witness, he said. Her throat tightened. You're bind. Corven's jaw clenched. We'll pull, he said. It can pull. I'm already missing pieces. His voice softened by a fraction, almost painful. I'm done letting the city eat itself so I can stay intact. Eira's eyes stung. Corven straightened and stepped away, becoming inspector again. Eira's fingers curled around the seal, cold and heavy and real. She forced her breathing to slow, forced her mind into the Bureau's language. Because if she was going to do this, she had to do it in the only tongue the Bureau respected: forms, protocols, laws, spells disguised as procedure. Eira rose from her chair. The movement drew attention like a ripple. Clerks looked up, startled. Petitioners blinked in confusion. Eira walked to the central dais near the mural, where public notices were read, where approvals and denials were sometimes announced for show. She held the inspector's seal in one hand and a blank petition sheet in the other. Her legs felt like they were made of damp paper. Her hands shook. But she kept walking. At the dais, Eira pressed the seal onto the blank sheet with trembling force. The imprint bloomed: authorized field demonstration, civic threat review. A murmur rolled through the hall like wind through reeds. Vale turned slowly, his pale gaze sharpening. What is this? He said, voice smooth with danger. Eira's mouth went dry. She lifted her chin. A petition, she said, and her voice shook but held, for immediate civic threat demonstration under statutory review. The words were correct. The cadence was correct. The Bureau could not dismiss correct language without revealing its own corruption. Vale's gaze flicked to the seal, then to Corven. Corven stood unmoving behind Eira, his face blank with official calm. Vale's eyes narrowed. Inspector Rooke, he said softly. Corven's voice was steady. I am witness to an anomaly in Canal Ward response that indicates the joyless lock is exacerbating a civic threat, he said. Eira's heart pounded so hard she felt dizzy. Vale's smile returned, thin and sharp. And you propose, he said, to demonstrate it here? In my registry hall? Eira swallowed hard. Not here, she said. On the canals. In daylight. With witnesses. So the Bureau cannot call it rumor. Vale's gaze held hers. It was like standing under a cold lens. You are a clerk, Vale said. You do not conduct demonstrations. Eira's fingers tightened around the petition paper. I am also a citizen, she said, and her voice steadied as anger rose to meet fear. And your statutes allow any citizen to petition for civic review when a threat affects public welfare. Vale's eyes flicked, almost imperceptibly, as if he had not expected her to know that. Then his expression smoothed. Very well, he said softly. We will indulge this performance. To show the city that the Bureau is not afraid of sentiment. A few petitioners shifted, uneasy. A clerk near the counter clasped her hands as if in prayer. Vale gestured toward the doors. Proceed, he said. But know this, Miss Sallow, if you incite unlawful witchcraft, you will be arrested on the spot. Eira's throat tightened. Understood. Corven's gaze remained fixed, but Eira saw the tension in his jaw. The bind was already pulling at him, unseen but relentless. They moved out of the registry hall in a small procession, Vale and 2 wardwrights, Corven, Eira, and a scattering of clerks drawn by fear and curiosity. A few petitioners followed too, hungry for anything that might change the air. Outside, the canals ran through the city like veins filled with dark water. The morning was overcast, the light flat. The joyless lock hum vibrated faintly through stone. Vale led them to the canal edge near the Bureau's main bridge, where the water flowed under wardposts etched with suppressive sigils. The air here felt tight, pressing down on the chest. "Demonstrate," Vale said. Eira's hands trembled. She felt every eye on her. She felt the weight of the Bureau's fear of chaos like a hand on her throat. She pulled out her petition scraps. They were irregular pieces, edges torn, bits of official seals half visible. The kind of paper the Bureau threw away when hope didn't fit. Eira knelt at the canal edge and began to fold. Crease. Turn. Tuck. Press. Her fingers were slow at first, clumsy under scrutiny. Then muscle memory took over, and the paper became what it always became in her hands, a small vessel, sharp prow, cupped hull. She did not write a grand wish. She did not write anything that reached for control. She wrote, in graphite, "May we be allowed to hope without harm." A hush fell over the watchers. Even the canal seemed to pause. Vale's eyes narrowed. "That is not lawful," he murmured. Eira looked up, her voice quiet. "It's not a demand," she said. "It's permission." Vale's mouth tightened. "Hope is not governed by permission," he said coldly. "It is governed by restraint." Corven's voice cut in, controlled but edged. "Restraint without relief becomes suppression," he said. Vale's gaze snapped to him. "Be careful," Vale warned. Corven went very still. Eira felt the air around him tighten, as if the bind had tugged hard at the warning. Eira turned back to her boat before fear could unravel her. She drew the dissolving sigil. Loop and dot. Dawnbound. She pressed 2 fingers to the hull and breathed out her intent, not forceful, not frantic, just honest. The boat shimmered faintly. Eira set it on the canal. The water took it. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the canal surface rippled. A pale filament rose beneath the boat, the hush thread drawn up like a hunger-smelling food. A murmur rose from the clerks. One woman stepped back instinctively. Vale's eyes sharpened with satisfaction, as if he had been waiting for proof of danger. "There," he said softly. "See what you bring." Eira's chest tightened. The filament touched the boat. And thinned. It did not tighten. It did not lash. It loosened like a hand unclenching. The water's surface smoothed. The oppressive pressure in the air eased by a fraction so subtle it would have been missed if everyone in the group hadn't been holding their breath. A sound came from behind Eira, small, startled. A laugh. A petitioning woman near the back of the group had covered her mouth with her hand as if embarrassed by the noise that had escaped. Her eyes widened as if she hadn't expected herself to remember how. Vale's face tightened. "Coincidence," he snapped. Eira folded a second boat. This time she wrote. "Let the locks loosen without breaking." She released it. Another filament rose, then eased. The air lightened again, a fraction more. The canal's dark sheen shifted, as if color remembered itself. A wardwright near Vale frowned, calibrator beads in his palm beginning to glow in a steady pattern that did not match lash detection. Vale's gaze flicked to the beads. The first crack of uncertainty appeared at the edge of his composure. Eira folded a third boat, hands trembling now not with fear alone, but with the fragile shock of hope being witnessed. She wrote, "Let us speak our longing without being punished." She released it. This time, the canal filaments did not surge like hunger. They drifted, curious, then softened as the boat passed, as if learning a new habit. The pressure in the air eased enough that Eira's lungs filled more easily. Someone in the watching crowd began to cry quietly, not with hysteria, but with relief, as if they had been holding themselves shut for so long they'd forgotten tears could be gentle. Vale's jaw clenched. "Stop," he said, voice hard. Eira froze, her next scrap of paper half folded. Corven stepped forward, his voice steady. This is the demonstration you granted, he said. You cannot revoke it because the evidence displeases you. Vale's eyes snapped to Corven, sharp with cold fury. I can revoke anything, Vale said softly. I wrote the statutes that allow it. Corven's face went very still. Eira felt the bind tug again, an invisible hook in Corven's mind. Corven swallowed once, hard. When he spoke, his voice was controlled but rough at the edges. Then you wrote them to protect the city, he said, or you wrote them to feed on it. A collective gasp moved through the onlookers. Vale's expression turned to ice. Inspector, he said, you are dangerously fatigued. Corven's jaw clenched. His hand rose briefly to his temple, fingers pressing, as if holding something in place. Eira's stomach dropped. The bind was pulling hard now. Corven's memories, whatever he had left, were at risk. Eira stepped forward before she could think better. Architect Leggett, she said, voice shaking, we have records. Vale's gaze flicked to her, contemptuous. You have scraps, he said. Corven's satchel shifted at his side, heavy with torn proof. Vale's eyes narrowed toward it. Arrest her, Vale said, crisp. 2 warded guards moved forward. Eira's blood went cold. Corven stepped between them and Eira. The movement was simple. It was not dramatic. It was not a heroic flourish. It was just a man putting his body where the law wanted to be. The guards hesitated because Corven was an inspector, because his authority was real, because the Bureau's hierarchy was its own kind of spell. Vale's voice sharpened. Inspector Rooke, he said. Do not interfere. Corven's hand pressed again to his temple, harder now. His face tightened. Eira saw it, pain, fear, the bind's hook drawing taut. Corven's voice came out low. If I allow this, he said, and the words trembled despite his control, I lose myself for mercy. Vale's smile was thin. Then obey, he said gently, monstrously gentle. And remain whole. Corven stared at Vale, jaw clenched like a man biting through iron. Then Corven's gaze shifted to Eira. Eira's eyes stung. She shook her head slightly, a silent plea, don't. Corven's expression changed, not into softness, exactly, but into something steadier than fear. He inhaled, slow. And he stepped aside, not away from Eira, but toward Vale. I will not obey, Corven said. The words were quiet. They landed like thunder. Eira felt the air tighten, then, sharply, release, as if the city itself had been waiting for someone to say that aloud. Corven's bind reacted immediately. Corven's body jerked as if struck. His breath hitched. His hand flew to his temple, fingers digging in. Eira's stomach dropped. Corven. Corven's eyes unfocused for a heartbeat, then sharpened again, wild, terrified. He tried, swallowing. I can't, he blinked hard. I can't remember. His voice broke. Eira stepped forward without thinking, reaching for him. And stopped herself a breath away, palms open, offering without grabbing. Look at me, she whispered. Just look. Corven's gaze snapped to her, frantic. Eira forced her voice steady. You are Corven Rooke, she said. You stand by the canal. Your coat smells like rain and metal. You drink bitter tea. You hate unnecessary ornament. You are here because the city is hurting and you couldn't ignore it anymore. Corven's breath came ragged. Vale watched with cold satisfaction. Let him unravel, Vale murmured. That is the cost of mercy. Eira's chest burned with anger. She turned her head, eyes wet, and stared at Vale. No, she said, voice shaking. That is the cost of your cruelty. She grabbed a handful of petition scraps and began folding with shaking speed, not into a flood of boats, not into chaos, but into a line of small dawn-bound vessels, each one bound to dissolve, each one carrying the same lawful, humble permission. She wrote quickly, the graphite smudging her fingers. May we be allowed to hope without harm. May we be allowed to hope without harm. May we be allowed to hope without harm. She drew dissolving sigils on each. Loop and dot. Loop and dot. Her breath shook as she poured intent into them, steadily, carefully, resisting panic. Not demanding love. Not demanding victory. Not demanding control. Only permission. She released the boats onto the canal in a cluster, letting the current take them. The filaments beneath the surface surged toward them, hungry. Then hesitated. Then thinned, as if overwhelmed by gentleness repeated, by hope expressed openly without coercion, without shame. The canal's surface rippled as if it remembered how to move. The oppressive hum of the joyless lock wavered. A Wardwright's calibrator beads flared not lash detection, but stabilization, the pattern Eira had seen in Corven's tests. The Wardwright's eyes widened. He looked at Vale. Vale's composure cracked. Containment, he snapped. Increase suppression. The wardposts along the canal edge hummed louder. For a heartbeat, the pressure slammed down again, hard enough that Eira's vision blurred. And then the boats drifted under the posts, their dissolving sigils shimmering faintly. The pressure eased. Not because the posts stopped suppressing, but because the boats gave the suppression nothing to feed on. The wishes were expressed, not swallowed. The hope was written, not crushed inward. The hush threads thinned where the vessels passed, starved of their favorite meal. The air lightened in a rush so sudden the onlookers swayed. Someone laughed again, louder this time, disbelieving, half-sobbing. A child near the back tugged his mother's sleeve and said, "Mama, why is the water pretty?" Eira's throat tightened. Vale's eyes widened, fury and fear twisting together. He stepped forward, reaching for the nearest boat with his hand as if he could crush proof by crushing paper. Corven moved without thinking. He caught Vale's wrist. The motion was swift and precise, and it stopped Vale cold. Vale's gaze snapped to Corven's face. Corven's breathing was still ragged, his eyes still bright with the aftershock of the bind's pull, but something in him had steadied. He looked at Vale and said, voice rough, "You can't keep feeding it." Vale's lips thinned. "You are losing yourself," he hissed. Corven swallowed, hard. "Then I will lose myself," he said, "and the city will live." Eira's chest ached so fiercely she thought she might break. Vale ripped his wrist free and turned on the Wardwrights. "Seize them," he snapped. "Both." The Wardwrights hesitated. Because their beads still glowed with stabilization. Because the canal air felt lighter. Because the people watching, clerks and petitioners and citizens, were beginning to understand, not in theory but in their own lungs, what suppression had been doing to them. A man in the crowd stepped forward, clutching a petition. "My wife forgot our daughter's name last night," he said, voice shaking. "This," he gestured helplessly at the boats. "This feels like something letting go." Another woman, cheeks wet, said, "I laughed. I haven't laughed in weeks." The crowd murmured, swelling. Vale's gaze darted across the faces and saw what he feared most, not chaos, but a public awakening. He had built laws like walls. Walls worked until people realized they could stand together on the other side. Eira's hands trembled. She forced herself to breathe slowly, to keep her intent humble, to keep the boats dissolving and safe. Corven's voice, low and urgent, came near her ear. "Now," he murmured again, different this time, less command, more plea. "The proof." Eira nodded and reached for Corven's satchel. Corven opened it and withdrew the torn pages from the sealed ledger. He lifted them high where the Wardwrights and clerks could see Vale's signature in the margins. "These are bright spill containment protocols," Corven said, voice rough. "They state suppression was used as stabilizer. They show the seal is fed by compressed hope. They bear the architect legate's hand." A stunned silence fell. Vale's face went pale for the first time. "Forgery," he spat. Corven's gaze was steady. "Read the ink," he said to the Wardwright nearest. "Calibrate it. You know the seals." The Wardwright hesitated, then stepped forward and took the pages with careful hands. He lifted his beads. The beads glowed, confirming age and seal. His brow furrowed as he read. Slowly, his gaze lifted to Vale. Vale's mouth tightened. Corven's breathing was still uneven. He pressed his fingers briefly to his temple, and Eira's stomach clenched, afraid another memory would snap. But Corven looked at her afterward, and in his gaze there was something steadier than before. Not because the bind had stopped pulling, but because he had chosen what mattered more than being whole. Eira's voice came out quiet but clear. "Legalize wishes," she said. A murmur rose, some shocked, some hungry, some afraid. Eira lifted her chin. Not reckless wishing, she said, forcing the bureau language into her mouth like a key. Not coercion. Not mass force. But lawful vessels, dawn-bound. Humble intent. Public registration if necessary. Permission instead of suppression. Balance wards that disperse lash instead of compressing hope. Vale's eyes narrowed. You would invite another bright spill. Eira shook her head, fingers smudged with graphite. The bright spill happened because wishing became a flood, she said. Because people weren't taught restraint, only denied until they broke. You've been squeezing the city for years. The hush is your consequence. Vale's voice went cold. You presume to rewrite law. Corven's voice cut in, steady despite its roughness. Law is a spell, he said. And you have been casting it to feed something you fear more than you admit. Vale's composure cracked into something ugly. I saved this city, he snapped. You don't understand what I held back. Eira's chest tightened. You held back hope, she said softly. And it learned to eat us from the inside. The wardwright with the pages stepped back, eyes shaken. He looked from Vale to Corven to the canal where the last of Eira's boats drifted, thinning filaments as they went. I confirm the signature, the wardwright said, voice tight. And the seal age. A sound moved through the crowd, shock turning into anger, anger turning into resolve. Vale's eyes darted, calculating escape routes. Corven stepped forward one pace, voice low. End the joyless lock, he said. Vale's lips curled. Or what? He hissed. You'll threaten me with paper boats? Corven's hand rose to his temple again, not from weakness but as if feeling the bind's hook and refusing to pretend it wasn't there. Or the city will see you, he said. And your law will stop working. Vale's jaw clenched. For a heartbeat, Eira thought he would double down, tighten the lock until the hush surged and swallowed them all in retaliation. Then, slowly, Vale's gaze shifted to the canal. The filaments were thinning. The seal was being starved. The city, for the first time in a long time, was not swallowing its breath. Vale's composure was a mask. Masks could be broken. Vale turned sharply and barked an order to his wardwrights, voice clipped. Suspend the lock. Temporarily. Pending review. The hum in the wardposts eased. The oppressive pressure lifted enough that people in the crowd exhaled in a rush, some laughing, some crying, some simply standing with their eyes wide as if seeing their own city for the first time. Eira's knees went weak. She put one hand on the stone canal edge to steady herself. Corven stood beside her, rigid, breathing unevenly. He looked pale. His eyes were too bright. Eira turned to him, fear sharp. Corven, what did it take? Corven stared at the canal, jaw clenched. For a moment he didn't answer, and Eira's heart sank, afraid he had lost too much, afraid his mind had frayed beyond repair. Then Corven blinked and looked at her. His gaze held hers steadily. I don't know, he admitted, voice rough. I know something is missing. He swallowed. But I know this, his gaze flicked to the boats. I chose right. Eira's eyes stung. She nodded, because nodding was all she could do without falling apart. The days that followed moved strangely, as if the city was learning to inhale again. The Bureau convened a formal review, not because Vale wanted it, but because too many clerks had witnessed the canal change, too many petitioners had felt the pressure lift. Wardwrights recalibrated arrays and confirmed what Eira and Corven had proven. Compression fed the hush, permission starved it. Vale fought, of course. He argued stability. He argued precedent. He argued that hope was dangerous. But the city had laughed in daylight. Once people remembered the sound, they did not forget easily. A new statute framework was drafted under public scrutiny, the Dawn Vessel Accord. It legalized wishcraft in a form the Bureau could endure without fear. Wishes must be written, humble, and non-coercive. Vessels must dissolve by dawn, leaving no accumulation. Lash-producing spells were restricted and monitored, not suppressed into secrecy. Balance wards were installed to disperse residue rather than compress emotion. Communal wishing required open witnessing and limited scale. It was not perfect. Law never was. But it was breathable. Eira found herself in rooms she had never been allowed into, sitting at tables with wardwrights and senior clerks, her hands still smudged with graphite as she explained folding geometry and dissolving sigils like they were civic infrastructure. Lysant cornered her one evening in the corridor outside Section D, eyes sharp. "So," Lysant said, "you did start a scandal." Eira's lips twitched. "It wasn't a scandal," she said. Lysant snorted. "It rewrote law. That's a scandal with better manners." Her gaze softened, just slightly. "You look less pale." Eira's throat tightened. "So do you," she said. Lysant looked away too quickly, pretending her eyes hadn't warmed. "Don't get sentimental," she muttered. "It's expensive." Eira almost laughed. Corven, meanwhile, moved through the bureau like a man who had survived drowning and still tasted water. There were gaps in him. Eira could see them in the way he paused sometimes mid-sentence, brow furrowing, as if reaching for a word that wasn't there. Some memories returned slowly after the joyless lock was suspended, small things resurfacing like driftwood after a flood. Others did not return. He told Eira once, late in the archive annex with the kettle humming, "There are places in my mind where I can feel the shape of what should be there." He stared at his tea as if reading it. And nothing answers. Eira's chest ached. She wanted to offer comfort that could fill those gaps. She could not. She could only offer herself, present, honest, steady. So she did. She brought him tea before he thought to. She left paper on his desk without comment, clean scraps that reminded him of what they had done. She spoke to him plainly, without pity. And Corven, slowly, learned to accept kindness without treating it like a trap. One evening, after the accord had been signed and the first set of legal dawnbound vessels had been released by the canal district under witness, Corven met Eira at Nessa Vell's stall. Nessa watched them with her usual frank warmth, pouring tea with steady hands. "You two look like people who've been holding their breath for years," she said. Corven's mouth twitched faintly. "We have," he said. Nessa slid a cup toward Eira, then toward Corven. "Then drink," she said. "And don't let the city steal the habit again." They drank in silence for a moment, steam curling between them. Eira stared into her cup, then lifted her eyes to Corven. "Do you remember the name you lost?" she asked quietly. Corven's gaze tightened. He shook his head once. "No." Eira's throat burned. "I'm sorry." Corven's eyes lifted to hers. This time he didn't flinch from the sympathy. He held it, weighed it, and let it exist. Then he said, voice low, "I remember you." Eira's breath caught. Corven looked away quickly, as if the admission had exposed too much. His fingers tightened around his cup. "Not just your name," he added, precise as always, trying to make it safer by making it technical. "I remember the way your boats steadied the wards. The way you speak truth in clerk terms. The way you—" He stopped, jaw tightening, as if the next words were too close to tenderness. Eira's heart pounded. She kept her voice soft. "The way I fold," she offered. Corven's mouth twitched again, almost a smile. "Yes," he said. Silence settled between them, not awkward, but full. Outside, the canal water moved with a gentler rhythm than it had weeks ago. Lantern light reflected on it in lines that looked less like broken coins and more like paths. Eira stared at the water, then back at Corven. "We should go," she said. Corven frowned slightly. "Where?" Eira's cheeks warmed. "On the canal," she said, voice quiet. "In a real boat. In daylight. No secrecy." Corven's gaze held hers. For a long moment, he did not move, as if the idea of being seen choosing something soft felt like stepping into sunlight after living underground. Then he set down his cup. "All right," he said. 2 days later, under a pale winter sun that actually felt like it might warm, they stood at a small rental dock in the canal district. The boats were narrow and plain, made for transport, not romance. But the water beneath them looked clearer, the air lighter. People on bridges leaned over the stone railings and watched a cluster of dawnbound paper vessels drift by, legal now, witnessed, dissolving like promised. Eira stepped into the boat carefully, hands out for balance. Corven offered his hand. It was not dramatic. It was not possessive. His palm was steady and open, offered without demand. Eira placed her fingers in his. His hand was warm. For a heartbeat, she expected the city's laws to reach up and punish them for the intimacy of it. Nothing happened. Corven steadied her into the boat and stepped in after her, moving with the careful control of someone who had spent too long afraid of missteps. He took up the oar and pushed them away from the dock with a firm, practiced motion. Eira watched him row, the muscles in his forearms shifting beneath his sleeves. The canal carried them forward, slow and quiet. The city around them looked the same, stone, iron, fog at the edges, but something in it had loosened, as if it had remembered it was allowed to live. Eira let her fingers trail just above the water. The surface rippled, cool and clean. A paper boat drifted past them, dissolving sigil faintly visible near its stern. Eira leaned closer to read the graphite inside its hull. "Let me find my courage." Her throat tightened. Corven's gaze followed hers. "They're still small," he said quietly. "They should be," Eira whispered. "Small is honest." Corven rowed them under a bridge where the stone was carved with old ward marks. Sunlight fell through the arch in a pale ribbon. For a moment, it lit Corven's face fully. Eira saw him then not as an inspector, not as a weapon, not as a man bound to forgetfulness, but as a person sitting in a boat on a canal, choosing to exist in daylight. She swallowed. "Corven," she said softly. He looked at her. Eira's chest ached with the words she wanted to say, words too big for law, too warm for a city that had punished warmth. So she said something smaller. "Thank you," she whispered. Corven's gaze held hers. He looked like he wanted to respond with a statute clause, something safe and precise. Instead, he said, voice low and rough, "Stay." Eira's breath caught. "I will," she said, and the promise landed between them like a paper boat set on water, fragile, deliberate, and real. Corven's hand rested briefly on the oar handle, then moved, slow, careful, to the edge of the bench between them, not touching her, just close enough that Eira could feel the option of closeness, the offered nearness without demand. Eira shifted, inch by inch, until her shoulder brushed his sleeve. Corven went still for a heartbeat, then exhaled slowly, as if allowing himself to accept something gentle without bracing for punishment. The boat glided on. Behind them, the city's canals carried dissolving wishes toward dawn and dissolution, the hush threads thinning where permission traveled, not forced, not secret, but lawful and witnessed. Ahead, the water widened, and sunlight touched it like a blessing nobody had to petition for. Eira sat beside Corven, her shoulder warm against his arm, and let herself believe, carefully, humbly, that hope could be legal, and love could be steady, and neither of them had to disappear to make room for it.